Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me and see me?
We can hear you, but not see you.
Okay, good. So it's not been streamed yet.
But please go ahead, it's already been streamed.
Okay. Okay, very good. Then I would like to welcome everybody this afternoon to a series of 3 sessions organized by TMG Research on soils and the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration. I apologize for the delay. There is a bit of a delay between the Woover platform and our chat here. We will start straight away with our first session, which will focus on the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration. I apologize for the delay once again. My name is Sarah Dan. I'm the coordinator of TMG's Zero Lab, under which this session is and I'd like to hand over to we will start straight away with our first session, which will focus
introduce you
on
to the topic of this
UN
first
Decade
session.
on ecosystem restoration.
Over to you,
I apologize for the delay once again. My name is Sarah Dan.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, for opening it. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the decade, and dear friends of land and soils, I'm happy to moderate this first session where we are trying to explain why the contribution of soils to the decade of ecosystem restoration is so important, and how should we do it that soils and ecosystem restoration are working hand in hand. It goes without saying that ecosystem restoration would be impossible without considering the importance of soils. We all know that over the last years, soils have been degraded heavily, and that soils do not always receive the attention they deserve when it comes to different activities like ensuring food security, natural resource management, and others. And therefore, today we want to discuss how can we best learn from the experiences with soil restoration to forward it to the decade on ecosystem restoration in order to make this decade a success. Before I'm going to introduce our participants and our speakers today, let me briefly start with telling you a story from one of our projects. As you might know, TMG Think Tank for Sustainability is trying to link local activities with the global level. So we are working at local scale, and we are also doing work at the global scale. And we have conducted a project in Burkina Faso, where a woman, a mother of children, a small-scale farmer, she's earning her living from agriculture, and her family depends really on small-scale agriculture, where she had accessed a small plot of land, was not the most fertile one, but she managed over the years with traditional methods, compost, crop rotation, and things you all know, to make the soil a bit more fertile. One could consider this being a success story because it was restoration of ecosystems and her food security had been improved. So far, a nice success story. But what happened afterwards? The land, which has been made a bit more fertile by her, has been taken away because she didn't have secure access to the land. She didn't have tenure rights. Someone else took the land. It was a man, he produced cash crops, and he started to degrade the land again. So what can we learn from this story? And this is, and Bruno, now please the next slide. This is what I'm going to talk about today. What are the lessons we can learn from other restoration efforts for a high impact strategy to implement the decade on ecosystem restoration? Restoration is not a new topic. There have been several good models, several success stories. Some problems had been found out. If you look at RED Plus and all the activities in avoiding forest degradation and deforestation, one of the first things we would like to discuss today is how to learn the lessons from other restoration efforts for high impact strategies for the decade on ecosystem restoration. We, in our research, found out, and our speakers will tell more about it, that we have to create an enabling environment so that 1 billion or more than 1 billion smallholders can become stewards of ecosystems. They can actively support ecosystem restoration because they are able to link their personal food security, their improvement of livelihoods with the management of natural resources and with building up resilience. Therefore, from our perspective, we have to talk about a whole package of things to make the contribution of soils to ecosystem services a bit more successful. We have to talk about social innovation, secure land rights, access to knowledge, access to extension services, as well as what kind of technologies do we really need to make soil restoration a success story. And in the end, I would like to start with warning all of us that we should not dream of silver bullets which will solve the problems of degraded ecosystems. There is nothing such as a silver bullet. And even people who are dreaming of large-scale solutions to restore ecosystems have in the meantime realized it's not so easy because we have to link people and ecosystems. We have to create an enabling environment for ecosystem restoration. And I'm happy to introduce to you our three speakers. And our three speakers, thank you for joining us, are going to present from different perspectives what is needed that soils can provide important input for the decade on ecosystem restoration, and why soils are so important as one of the key pillars for ecosystem restoration. We have three speakers. First of all, Annalisa Mauro from the she's Global Network Coordinator of the International Land Coalition. I'm happy that she has joined us, and she's going to talk about tenure. She's going to talk about rights. She's going to talk, let me phrase it in one sentence, about the preconditions of the possibility of doing soil restoration. She will be followed by our friend and colleague Susan Chomba. She's project manager from the World Agroforestry Center, EGRAF. She is experienced in dealing with landscapes restoration. She is going to present how important it is to have a landscape approach so that we have to go beyond small plots for doing restoration. And then Martin Jemefak, he is from the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils from the Global Soil Partnership. I haven't seen his picture before, but I hope he is online so that he can present the perspective from the Global Soil Partnerships on the dynamics of soils. Soils is not only dirt, soils is a lot more, and this is what we are going to address. And then in the end, our colleague and friend, Tim Christofferson, he is the head of Nature for Climate branch from UN Environment in UNEP, is going to wrap up. But Tim, as I told you, if there are questions and you want to, before you are wrapping up, already contribute to the discussion, please let me know, and I'm happy to give the floor to you. So we have a panel presenting different views, but all looking at the same spot, the importance of land and soil for the ecosystem, for the decade on ecosystem restoration. Thanks again for joining us, and I'm happy to give the floor to Annalisa Mauro. We are working together since some years, and I'm really happy, Annalisa, that you are going to join us presenting the importance of tenure, of land rights, of human rights, and providing your perspective. Annalisa, the floor is yours. for 7 minutes, please. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you all, and thank you also for the great introduction. Please, the next slide. Next. So I will bring you into the dimension of the land rights, and that's very much important, as Alexander was mentioning, in framing the debate of the decade of ecosystem restoration. Why it's so important to focus on land, and why land is so important to have the people at the center. When it comes to the numbers, we see that 2.5 billion of people are indigenous people and local community, that they claim half of the world's land as land that belongs to them. And only 10% of this land is formally recognized. So the legality of it, it's very much limited compared to the claim that is upon this land. And what is happening with the 5 billion hectares that remain unlegalized, in a way those are unprotected and vulnerable for land grabs or even large-scale investment, that in a way change the nature of the ecosystem. So it's very much important to also consider that this land is very much the basis where the high rates of biodiversity is contained. Almost 36% of the global key biodiversity areas, in fact, are contained within the land of indigenous peoples and local community. When it comes, because was also one of the points that Alexander raised about food and the small-scale agriculture. Also, land is important in the frame of food security, as we all know, because 80%, even more, of the food that we are eating is produced by small-scale farmers that often they don't have a legal title of their land or the land that they work. Last not least, what is dramatically important to the eyes of the international coalition, but of the world, the entire world, is the dramatic numbers coming out of people who are normal citizens that, for defending their land, become land and environmental defenders. Global Witness is monitoring the type of killing that are related to land and environmental pressure, and only in 2018, 160 leaders have been killed. So the magnitude of why land is important vis-a-vis what we are discussing is for us fundamental, because we see it as a part of the solution. As Alexander was saying, it's a precondition to make many other things happening. Next, please. When it comes to the role of the International Land Coalition as a network of organizations, so we have more than 250 members organizations of different nature, from intergovernmental organizations, many CGIAR centers, and also civil society organizations. And we put at the center of our capacity of making impact the people-centered land governance. So if you see from the slides, you have people on one hand and landscape on the other hand, and they go intrinsically together. And when we approved the 10 commitments that for us represent what we mean for people-centered land governance, we put the issue of ecosystem management from the local land users at the core. We really want the community to be at the core of what is not only protection but restoration of the landscape. Local community makes them playing a bigger role in what is the today world and the future world. And when it comes to how we make this happening, that's the next slide, please. The role of the members of ILC is, in fact, strengthening the capacity of those communities to be protecting the landscape, and to make this. We work with multi-stakeholder platform in several countries to secure the land tenure rights. Individual, but also collective when it comes to the commons. For instance, we work on dry lands, rangelands, forestry, coastal lands, and always there is an issue of land security to empower the community to play their role, and even to assess the measures that are put in place for restoration. If those communities not given the land, they don't exist. In a way, they remain in the realm of the invisibility. And that doesn't allow them to play their role in managing ecosystem in a healthy way that can prevent this pandemic and even future crises. What we do then is to support those communities to legalize their land, but also to monitor, to make this visible and to make visible the contribution those communities can give into the restoration agenda and the target. And monitoring these data, generating data from geospatial data to data that are related to the community in performing their role as stewards of the landscapes, is becoming a role that we are taking more and more. Linking the local with the national and the global dimension of the restoration is very much important. As Alexander was saying, there is no a global dimension of it, but if we catalyze a land movement of people that can contribute to the decade of restoration, that's where we can play a role. Putting the community at the center is for us a must. I'm ready for other questions when those will come, and to explain a bit more what the coalition is doing in working with community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. From my perspective, and I like simple messages, your very clear message was ecosystem restoration has to be rights-based. This is one of the important contributions of the work you are doing to highlight that appropriate technologies, participation has to be accompanied by rights of the people so that they can benefit and that their restoration efforts in the end can really lead to what we need to stop, to halt degradation and to restore degraded lands. Thanks a lot for this very clear message. And thanks a lot for staying absolutely within the 7 minutes. I'm happy to hand the floor now over to Susan Chomba from ECRAF. She has done tremendous work on changing landscapes for the better, looking not only at small plots in the fields, but how to manage landscapes so that landscapes can be green on the one hand, and that they can contribute to improving livelihoods of people on the other hand. Susan, you have 7 minutes now. The floor is yours. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Alexander, and thank you so much to all the participants of this session. So I'll be bringing a few interesting lessons from Regreening Africa project, which is the project that I manage across 8 countries in Africa. And the map that is in front of you shows you our countries of intervention, but also the extent of degradation in as much as vegetation cover is concerned. Of course, this session is very much about soils, but there's a very close linkage between vegetation and soils, which I'll be going into in my discussions today. But just to put the perspective of the problem that is ahead of us, the ELD report that was published in 2015 in collaboration with UNEP shows that in the last 40 years, we've lost at least 1/3 of the arable land to land degradation, and especially processes of soil erosion. And in that, Africa is one of the most affected continents, which is why I'm very, very passionate and working in this continent, because I think there's a lot we can be able to build from processes of restoration. And the same report indicates that we lose at least 12.5% of the GDP across the 42 countries that the study was looking at through land restoration. Yet, the benefits of restoring that land on this continent is at least 7 times, it's at least 7 times the cost. So the benefit is 7 times higher than the cost, and it only comes at 1.15% of our GDP. So these statistics are not here. The report is freely available online. It's 2015. But what the point is, there's so much to gain from restoring degraded lands in Africa. Next slide, please. And this slide basically comes from the report again from Landscape, People and Nature. And why I like this infographic, it shows the interconnectedness between land restoration and how we can contribute to the different SDGs. So you have SDG 2 on zero hunger, SDG 2, SDG 6, SDG 15, several SDGs that we can be able to contribute as a result of land restoration. But coming to the point of scale, I'd like to emphasize a point that Alexander already mentioned earlier about the interconnectedness between human and nature. We are seeing mega cities like Delhi and other mega cities across the world suffering from pollution because of human activities, either in industrial production or in agriculture production. And that also has an effect on land, water, and air. So pollution on land or unsustainable land management practices on land have effects on our water and has effects on our air. So the human and nature connection is very, very clear here. And why we must focus on landscape scale is because it's at a landscape level that we can be able to observe, to optimize trade-offs and synergies of sustainable land management practices. And I'll give you a very quick example here. So for instance, land restoration that involves tree planting, exotic tree plantings, for instance, a species like eucalyptus in Africa, very favored by farmers because it has economic benefits, yet it has some negative trade-offs when it comes to biodiversity and water flows. But when you consider at a landscape scale, an individual farmer can plant exotic trees, but then you can have communal lands and other protected areas within that landscape that then enhance biodiversity. So you're meeting both the needs of the farmer as well as the broader biodiversity goals when you look at landscape scale. So it's very, very important that we just don't concentrate on small scale, but at landscape level. And then of course, Alexander has already mentioned here about the aspect of embracing complexity. We do not want to focus on any silver bullets. Tree planting, farmer managed natural regeneration, soil and water conservation practices, and other land restoration practices are important for soils and should be looked at in terms of what options are suiting different contexts. Next slide, please. So in terms of soil here, this slide is I'm trying to look at what the soil health and how we can be able to work on that to be able to affect other aspects such as climate change mitigation. We know that there are several characteristics or indicators of soil health, such as soil organic carbon, soil erosion prevalence. And so if we can be able to enhance that through land restoration, you're not only contributing to climate change mitigation, but also agriculture productivity. And of course, as I mentioned, this is where you see the vegetation aspect being affected by the health of the soil. And in that, we contribute to the SDGs that I mentioned too. In the outer scale that you can see biodiversity, aspects of food and nutritional security. And what is going to be really, really critical is green job creation, especially in post-COVID, where we are seeing really loss of jobs and possible impacts on economic activities. Next slide, please. So here, just to quickly illustrate some of the land restoration practices that we do promote through Regreening Africa project, you can see soil and water conservation. Of course, there's tree planting, there's helping farmers to vegetatively propagate some of the indigenous tree species so that the period for their growth is shortened. As well as promoting fruit trees for income, for nutrition, for men or women and children, and as well as a practice that is commonly now known as farmer managed natural regeneration that does not involve tree planting, but involves regenerating from existing shrubs and seed stock that is much, much more successful than tree planting in arid and semi-arid areas. So just like last slide, please. So in conclusion, what I would say in terms of what we need to scale up are three things. This slide, there's something that is missing on the left, but we have the aspect of partnership, we have the aspect of investments, and then we have the aspect of practice. So I'd just like to emphasize the partnership between different stakeholders from the local level, bottom-up processes, national level actors and governments, research organizations. We need to be able to develop restoration practices that are suitable for the different contexts, international agencies, private sector, and of course the funding agencies. And then we need to put our money where our mouths are in terms of investing in land restoration. And last but not least, it's the aspect of practice. I think there has been a lot of concentration at the global level, but very little action at the local level, and we need to move that. So that makes the summary of my presentation today. And we have our contact details on the very last slide. In case you need more information, please feel free to visit our website or follow us on Twitter and Facebook page. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Susan. exactly 7 minutes. And if I try to recap, the key message I had understood is that investing in greening landscapes generates a lot of return. Social capital for the people, natural capital for food production and the environment, but it also contributes to human health. And therefore, investing in landscapes is an investment in the future of people and planet. My takeaway message. And thanks a lot for this very clear presentation. Now I would like to give the floor to Martin Jemefak from the Global Soil Partnership. He is very well known as a soil scientist, and I would like him to talk about the dynamics of soils, why soils are such a complex issue. Soils are not only dirt, which makes our houses dirty and we have to clean it afterwards. It has a very rich soil biodiversity. It's the basis of our life, and soils is the basis of food production. Martin, I hope you are online and you can hear me. I would like to hand over the floor to you for the next 7 minutes to present your point of view as a member of the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils. Martin, please go ahead. At least I cannot hear you, Martin. And I guess this has been built as a test for me, if I can find a way to overcome the next 2 or 3 minutes before Martin is going to join us. I have not seen him, and therefore let's be flexible. I would like to, before Martin is going to join us, trying to raise the first question that we have received from the audience. You are putting your question on Whova. You put them there, and internally these questions will be forwarded to me. And in order to ensure that this is really happening, I'm using now the first question which has been put to the 2 speakers. The question is, how can we ensure that restoration initiatives do not reinforce inequalities? Another dimension, restoration efforts should not reinforce inequalities. And I think, Annalisa, you should be the first for a brief answer, and then I would also like to hand over to you, Susan. Annalisa, what is the link between restoration and inequality?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting question. In fact, I think with the crisis, the COVID, the issue of inequality became very much evident to the eyes of everybody, and with the failure of the environmental systems and economic systems when it comes to the local dimension, I would say definitely. Could the restoration exclude community and reinforce inequality? Definitely. Yes, it's very much possible, and that's where I'm stressing the point of making visible and formally recognize the rights of the community and the local people, indigenous peoples, because that's the first essential element to allow them to access all the measures that are put in place for restoration, even with the RED programs of environmental solutions that are put there. We work together in South Africa, for instance, to support a multi-stakeholder platform. And the main challenge was make visible the role of the communities to access to the service provided by the government to face the current crisis. In a way, this issue of invisibility, the fact that the community, they have not formally recognized by the states, is making them in a situation that is very, very much vulnerable. And so restoration can become a machine or a business where the stronger are accessing with the capacity, of course, of having a technical skills or political influence that allow them to be positioned in accessing to those opportunity. But often this is not the case for communities. This is where the work should start. And when we come to soil, or when it comes to the landscape per se, the vision, it's possible to be built in a long-term perspective only if the basic rights are recognized. There is no way to go otherwise. People are migrating, conflicts are generated because people, they have no this secure access to right. I think it should be a solution to start with as a precondition to build an inclusive society, but also a more sustainable and resilient society. There are a few cases that are showing now in the current situation of the virus and the pandemic. Few countries are accelerating the recognition of land rights for a local community, because this is, and it is a very wise measure if it's not confirming historical injustice. Now, for instance, in Nepal, there is a commission that is now accelerating the process of land redistribution. But the risk that indigenous peoples of Nepal have not been part of this process of recognition of their rights. So their rights, their land can be given to others to respond to other needs and priority. So I think there is an issue there, and that's why the emphasis on land rights is a bit of a basic in terms of social justice, in terms of democracy, but also in terms of environmental restoration, as should be a must.
Thanks a lot, Annalisa. While waiting for Martin Jemefak, I would raise the question in a slightly different way to you, Susan. You had mentioned that the benefits of landscape restoration are 7 times higher than the costs. So in the end, the question has to be answered, who benefits from landscape restoration? Should the owners of the land, the stewards of the land, the people who are doing the restoration, should the most vulnerable benefit from it? What is your experience in the Greening Africa project with distribution of benefits? Susan, please.
That's a fantastic question, Alexander. And just again, to emphasize that also the same report that I'm quoting does show that there's a statistically significant relationship between poverty gap and soil nutrient depletion. So countries that are extremely poor also did exhibit poor soil land management practices. And therefore, I would start first of all at the aspect of equity, even at the global level, by focusing on areas where land degradation is really, really a big issue, and realizing that we will need to invest significantly higher in places where communities are really, really affected. And then comes to your question, Alexander. So then who benefits? That's an extremely important question, partly answered by the land rights discussion, because obviously a lot of poor people, a lot of disproportionately poor people do also lack access to land or even ownership to land. And therefore, if distributions of benefits is based on ownership or management of land, then we are likely to exclude a big proportion of needy communities. And so therefore, the distribution of benefits to land restoration needs to recognize, first of all, that a community is not a homogeneous unit. There are different socio-economic stratifications between people in that community, and these people have different levels of access and power towards a land. And therefore, if we are to invest in land restoration, we have to see how to be inclusive. And in Greening Africa, for instance, what we try to do is also to negotiate around access of benefits of land restoration at the communal level. So necessarily there are benefits that can come, not necessarily from individual land, from community land. How can those benefits be distributed so that even people who may not own or access land can still be able to benefit from the restoration process itself, as well as from the benefits that are accruing to it? I think you mentioned that we've learned a lot from REDD+, and there are many publications, including some by myself, that do point out to the key question of land and how we can be able to avoid exacerbating access to benefits as a result of either REDD+ mechanisms or other land restoration mechanisms. So that's very, very crucial. And I would not finish this point without especially pointing the aspect of women and youth, who you gave a very touching poignant point when you mentioned about the woman who restored her land And then in the end, the land was taken away from her because she did not have secure rights to that land. And therefore, recognizing that these aspects can be fluid, that somebody could be managing land at some point and then it can be taken away from them if the rights are not secure, is really, really important. And that's why I said we need to engage not just with the communities, but also with the national and subnational governments, especially to be able to mainstream and to address aspects of land tenure and tree tenure that are critical for access to benefits from restoration. So briefly, I think that's what I'd just like to add to what has already been said.
Thanks a lot, Susan. So again, my interim conclusion, there is a broad agreement that restoration is needed, that restoration creates benefits for people, for nature, for jobs, for the future, for the planet. But we have to be very careful that we don't overlook who is benefiting and who pays. So even if you are successful in restoring degraded landscapes, you have to look if the poorest people who are living on these landscapes are really benefiting from it. So, Susan, a follow-up question. You mentioned the importance of women. What is your experience in regreening Africa? How could you ensure that women can benefit from the work you have done? And I would like to refer to the experience of RED Plus, where it was very clear that you have to introduce safeguards into all your efforts to avoid deforestation or to halt forest degradation. So 3-4 sentences on your experience. How did women benefit and what are your experiences? And then I would go over to Tim Christopherson. Tim, please prepare yourself. My question will be, what magnitude of restoration are we talking about? I will come back to it later, but first, Susan.
So first of all, Alexander, in terms of women, what we realize with land restoration is some of the land restoration activities that we are actually carrying out can be quite labor intensive. And so if we do not structure them properly, we end up adding more extra burden on women who already have a lot to deal with, and especially I'm talking about rural women. And so first of all is to structure land restoration activities so that you have activities that are both suited for women and those that are suited for men, but also ensuring that in the end of it all, what you're doing is a participatory process so that the benefits then do not exclude the women. So it's very important to have structured engagement at the local level and agreements with local communities on who is supposed to contribute to what and who is supposed to benefit from what. So that is very, very critical. And we have learned that through the Regreening Africa project. Secondly, it's the challenging of gender norms at the community level. And again, we have worked with the social scientists from ECRAF in terms of understanding what are the gender norms that do limit women in participating in land restoration practices, as well as in benefiting, including aspects I mentioned, tree tenure, and I'll give an example in the Sahel. Women are very, very much dependent on some of the tree products that are a result of maintaining trees in the ecosystem, talking of products like shea butter, which we all know are globally very valuable products. But when it comes to the ownership of the shea tree, it's passed down through the male lineage. And so women can again lose access to that tree product once it becomes an economically viable activity. So these gender norms, we constantly engage with local communities and discuss, but also the critical thing, what we are trying to do is to then engage with local authorities to be able to structure this so that there are some local bylaws that do stipulate in terms of rights for women in terms of the resources that they are experiencing. So there's the aspect of gender norms, there's the aspect of labor, and then, of course, there's the aspect of rights to land, and there's the aspect of right to trees and how women are benefiting from it. So it's really getting into the nitty-gritty details and understanding those social dynamics at the community level so that you can be able to ensure that women are participating and then are therefore benefiting from restoration processes.
Thanks a lot, Susan. While you have explained your position, I have received a reply from Annalisa, and she said, it is important for this reason to include the names of women in all legal documents and to ensure that there are really land rights for women so that they have a stronger legal position. We should always remind ourselves that informal rights, secondary rights are really very important, and we cannot rely on the goodwill of some people. This is never going to work. I have already announced that we had waited for Martin Jemefak. So far, we cannot see him, and maybe he's not able to join us on this panel. And therefore, I would like to include Tim Christofferson from UNEP, who is going to do the closing remarks. And I would like to ask him now, Tim, we are talking about huge amounts of land to be restored. FAO is always talking about that the world is losing 24 billion tons of topsoil every year by erosion, land and water, they are gone. So there's a huge investment need. Do you really think that small-scale farmers can essentially contribute to it? Or is your position that we need large-scale restoration efforts in order to deal with the challenges? And I'm going to ask then our two other panelists, Annalisa and Susan, to provide comments on what you have said. Tim, please.
Thank you, Alexander, and thanks to the TMG team for putting together this session. Small-scale farmers are, of course, absolutely essential for restoration because there are so many of them. There's an estimated 1 billion smallholder farmers. Together, the amount of land that they manage is, of course, enormous, even though it might only be a hectare or two per household. So coming back to that question of who benefits, I think it's also a way to approach that by asking who suffers from land degradation. Because there are also people who benefit from land degradation. And the key to success of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will be to link the social and the environmental aspects of restoration. This is it's a social change that we require most of all, and for that you need imagination and inspiration of new ways of managing the land. So asking who suffers from land degradation goes way beyond the smallholder farmers. In fact, there are about 3.2 billion people who are negatively affected by land degradation, according to the to IPBES and also the IPCC land report. So it goes beyond the people actually working the land. You can even trace it to Europe or North America, where migration from the Sahel or other areas where the land can no longer support people is affecting political stability. And when you then come to the question, who will benefit from addressing land degradation and from restoration, it's of course a difference of who can pay for the required investments and who will be mostly involved in doing the work of restoration on the ground. So this question of if smallholder farmers can benefit, absolutely. If they have to play a role, absolutely. And luckily, this was brought up already by Susan, also by you, Alexander, that we are building on knowledge from REDD+ and other efforts where we've learned about free, prior, and informed consent. We've learned about the importance of benefits from restoration or any kind of investments for local communities. What we will have to keep an eye on is that, of course, there is also large money that might be invested in ecosystem restoration, including from from climate change mitigation payments. So the question of who owns the land, who has the right to manage the land, who owns the carbon, are critically important. If we get the formula right, and we've now worked on this for more than a decade in REDD+, but also with other approaches, if we get it right, then both smallholder farmers, but also big projects will have a role in restoring at least the 350 million hectares that the Bonn Challenge outlines.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Now I would like to ask Annalisa and then Susan for a brief comment. In the meantime, we have received the question, what is the role of technologies? You are talking about social rights, you are talking about social innovation. What is the role of innovation in technologies? And how is it linked, Annalisa, to the question of rights? And then Susan, you please provide a comment from your perspective. And Annalisa, don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So just to follow what Tina was saying, because I think it's very much important that the decade of ecosystem restoration is very timing. Because in a way, it's taking advantage of the global crisis due to the pandemic to rethink completely the way in which we do. I think there is a social pact that we need to reorganize around new principles. And that's why I say it's a very good opportunity where definitely the social environmental aspects, as pointed out by Tim, are crucial. I would not underestimate also the economic change. Because we went from a predatory or exploiting type of economy with no limits to a zero impact. And now we need to restore. So we need to change, even the balance need to become positive, whatever we do. Circular economy is not even sufficient. We need to do better on that. So I think it's a very, very powerful moment for the decade to be successful, because the premises and the premises are changing, and in a way we need to discuss more of the value of it. So we have been doing this work for a long, long time, all of us here, in trying to reposition people at the center of the decision making. We fight against injustice, inequality, poverty, and this is a moment where we can use the decade to be a very good change maker into the discussion at all levels, from the local to the national to the global. So I'm very grateful to UNEP and FAO to lead this process. And we should never waste a good crisis. I think there are elements there that can be taken in a very constructive way. Those are my points with respect of the comments by Tim. When it comes to technology, it's very much a must in all terms, from the legal innovation to the research. We're working a lot on data. And so if there is, from a land perspective, technology is very much linked to the security of land rights when it comes to mapping, when it comes to the perimeters, to take, to monitor trends of environmental changes, even to protect. No, we use technology to protect mainly, not necessarily to restore. I think this is something that we need to shift. We built two platforms. One is the Land Matrix, and the other one is Landmark, with other partners, of course, now that it belongs to all. And the one is monitoring large-scale land acquisition, we're above 200 hectares, so it comes to millions of hectares of transactions, of land transactions. And eventually there, we need to expand a bit more the impact. We assess the classical type of things. If there is, when there is a large-scale land acquisition, there is an environmental assessment. I see time is...
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. We have now 11 more minutes until the final closing.
Okay, so I leave it. And yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Susan, I would like to try again to ask, is Martin Jelmefak, has he in the meantime joined us? There's a person on our list of participants called Safari. Is this you, Martin, hiding behind this very nice name? It is not the case. Then I would like to ask Susan to provide her comments. And Tim, please be prepared. In 3 minutes, I will hand over to you for closing this session. Susan, please.
Yes, Tim, I think the decade for ecosystem restoration couldn't have come at a better time. And just to again emphasize what Annalisa has said, I think it's a time now of very much uncertainties and risks. And also, but it also provides a very great opportunity for us, as Alexander has put it before, to build back better. And in the context of Africa, I think one of the key things that we have to think in terms of restoration is how we can make it transformative and how we can make it be able to address some of the core challenges of youth unemployment, of probably a huge impact on economies that were already pretty vulnerable as a result of COVID-19. And so restoration has to go beyond just looking at vegetations and soil. It has to look also at how we can be able to empower youth, how we can be able to empower other actors, and therefore catalyze action from the national governments in these countries. I think if we can make a strong enough case for the economics of it, as well as for the biodiversity element, for the livelihood element and climate change, then we have a real good opportunity here to make a significant difference. Now, quickly, just to respond to the question on the role of technologies. I think technology has its place. We have technologies for land restoration. We have technologies for monitoring land restoration, and therefore technology is really, really critical. But what we have to be aware of is when we tend to replace every other element of social inputs through technology, when we think that we can simply just restore massive areas through by having huge drones flying around and therefore just restore all the degraded lands. I think that's what we have to be aware of, that there are significant challenges when we have that as an approach to restoration. We need to understand the socio-economic elements of it, that land restoration is about people, and that technology has its place and it's really, really important, but it cannot replace the human element in the restoration process itself. So thank you so much. I think I'd like to end there.
Thanks a lot, Susan. Now over to you, Tim. You have 5 minutes, 6 minutes to present from your perspective. What is the result of this session on the decade on ecosystem restoration? Tim, go ahead.
Thank you, Alexander. And it was great to hear from Annalisa and Susan. I agree with everything they've said. I think the key summarizing comments I would like to make in relation to the UN decade is, first of all, a quote from Greta Thunberg. Let's not talk about returning to normal after COVID-19, because normal was also a crisis. Normal meant we kept over 800 million people malnourished, 3.2 billion people suffering from land degradation, biodiversity in free fall, climate change spiraling out of control. We don't want to go back to that normal. That would be highly dangerous. So what we need right now, more than anything, is imagination. We need the power of the human mind to imagine a future that can be different. And restoration requires exactly that. It requires you to see a space, a landscape, a community, and imagine what that would look like if it was restored. Decent jobs for everyone, more equality, more stable food supplies, water security. My second point is about the economics. We talked about linking the social and the environmental aspects of restoration. The economic aspect is, of course, a good argument we need to make right now. And the closing panel of the GLF Summit will be on building back better on Friday. We use the figure from IUCN, $1 invested in restoration generates $9 of returns for society. For any politician, that should be a very, very good argument for investing in land restoration rather than in bailing out the fossil fuel industry or other big investments that are now seriously being considered by the world's finance ministers. So we have to make that case and we have to make it on the streets if needed, because that's the future that is being decided there. And the decisions that are made now will stick with us for generations. My third point is a quick summary of what the UN Decade actually is, because we've heard a lot about it, and we have a strategy that is a 16-page document. I encourage all of you to read it. It's on the Decade website. We've now received over 1,500 comments on the Decade strategy, including some from Annalisa and her colleagues and others. So we are working on those, and we'll have a final strategy ready by September. Mostly it's all very supportive, so the Decade indeed comes at a very good time. It follows three pathways: the global movement building, the political will generation, and the capacity, both financial and technical, for doing restoration. In that context, we have to keep in mind that it's not all about win-wins. We will have to address some vested interests, because there are people, as I said earlier, who benefit from the current system and from land degradation and from running landscapes into the ground. And those people might lose, but luckily they're in the majority. They're in the minority. In the majority are the people who would benefit from a restored community and from restored landscapes. Unfortunately, those people are sometimes in positions of power, so we have to be prepared to also tackle those discussions of how to create a new social compact at the landscape level. And for that, and I'll come to the close with that, the grassroots level and action on the ground is really most important. We have a lot of these webinars, and I love speaking with all of you, but we know each other and we meet each other regularly, and there's constituency out there that supports this agenda. But what we have too few of are the champions on the ground who do the actual restoration work. So whatever help we can give them, mentoring, finance, and linking them up with each other would be the key priorities for us. So supporting the action on the ground and channeling finances there. And there's also where technology can play a role, because to reach all these smallholder farmers, you need new technologies for them to have access to some capital, to some finance, to knowledge. And we have all the tools available to make that happen. I'll stop here, and thanks again for organizing this session, the TMG team.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Let me first of all thank all the participants who have listened, who have contributed with questions. Would like to thank Annalisa, Susan, and you, Tim, again for participating. I would like to thank the people who worked on the background, setting up quite a complex technological system so that we can be linked via Zoom and Woover and Teams and other things. It has worked, great stuff. And from my perspective, the last sentence: while we are fighting with the uncertainties of the corona crisis, of COVID, we have to, in parallel, also fight next crisis, which is already around the corner, the climate crisis. And the decade of ecosystem restoration will be an important contribution to this fight. Or let me say it in the other way: if the decade will not be successful, Tim, then we are not going to win the fight against climate change. I would like to put a little heavy burden on your broad shoulders to encourage you to continue to work. And you can rely on all the people participating here. We are happy to contribute to your success. Thanks a lot to all of you. A quick announcement that now there's a brief pause, and then we will start with our second session. The second session organized by TMG, but you have to log in differently. So enjoy your break. Thanks for participating. All the best for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Hi, Lee. Nice to meet you here again. I can see, yeah, you're already there, so that's good. One speaker. We can already have a session. Very nice. We're not yet live, and that's a good thing, I guess. I can't hear you. You are muted. Wait.
I will turn my video off for a few minutes, but I'm here and ready to start.
Very good. Excellent.
Thanks, Sarah.
Just waving. All set?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to warmly welcome you to this session titled Soil Organic Carbon, How Can Smallholder Farmer Communities Benefit from Carbon Sequestration Projects? This is the second session in a series of 3 interrelated sessions focusing on soil as keystone for food security and ecosystem restoration, and organized by us at TMG Research under the ZeroLab project. My name is Sarah Dahn, and I coordinate the ZeroLab project here at TMG. I am accompanied for the session by my colleagues Matteo, Luisa, and Bruno. The focus of the ZeroLab project is on exploring, developing, and advancing a combination of digital and social innovations for the food security of small-scale farmers and farming communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Under this action-oriented research project, we look at the potential of digital innovation in 3 key areas: urban agriculture and nutrition, sustainable land management, and soil organic carbon, and gender and access to natural resources. Central to our approach is the question how and under what conditions digital innovation translates into actual opportunities. Regarding soil organic carbon, this session will explore how small-scale land managers can get compensated for soil organic carbon conservation practices. High hopes are placed in further unlocking the land-based mitigation potential by changes in agricultural practices and advancing carbon sequestration in farmers' fields. And a plethora of initiatives and projects have been set up to enable this link. In Africa, as elsewhere in the developing world, local communities act as service providers for most of these restoration and carbon sequestration projects. The idea behind most of these projects is to foster a multiple win of increasing productivity, food security, improving ecosystem services and resilience to climate change, hence adaptation, and removing atmospheric CO2, hence mitigation, and to get paid for it. Although the potential of soil organic carbon has been recognized, there is less clarity about the magnitude of the opportunity and how to best capitalize on it. The experience of RED+ projects, for example, shows that the actual monetary benefit of smallholder farmers might be very small. It is still unclear how projects can be scaled, policies streamlined, and carbon markets and climate finance best mobilized. Uncertain land tenure arrangements, complex size and scalability operations, and carbon markets volatility contribute to these challenges. Obstacles, hence, do abound, but so do encouraging advancements. The last decades have seen the development of methodologies and accounting standards that are now covering a wide range of landscapes. Complemented by increasingly accessible digital solutions, monitoring systems now have the potential to reduce the transaction costs related to the implementation of projects. Where soils have been so far largely absent from carbon markets, there are signs that an international enabling environment for soil organic carbon to benefit smallholder farmers is potentially on the horizon. But what about the national and local enabling environment? As I just sketched, since the emergence of the first carbon sequestration projects, much emphasis has been placed on methods and mechanisms for carbon monitoring and accounting and setting voluntary carbon standards. Less time and thought has been spent on how these projects can obtain legitimacy with and deliver direct and long-term livelihood benefits to the local smallholder farming communities engaging in them. After all, financial compensation and improved soil fertility alone do not necessarily or automatically bring benefits to all or contribute to food or livelihood security for all. Underlying social, political, and institutional structures and processes often support or hinder certain social groups or communities in engaging or benefiting. Investing in sustainable land management makes sense to a smallholder farmer if their interest is actually addressed. And this might mean that projects also need to think about and include social and organizational transformations in their design. We have learned a number of lessons from the first session in this series of 3, but now we would like to focus a little bit deeper on specifically lessons that we can use for the design of soil organic carbon projects. So what has to be in place for smallholder farming communities to actually feel they benefit from a carbon sequestration project, also in the long term? And under what conditions do individual smallholders deem it worth investing time, effort, and resources in sustainable land practices? What monitoring practices can reduce transaction costs and which ones do not? Some of the answers may be provided by looking at and learning from the implementation of RED+ projects. Some answers are provided by looking a little closer at monitoring approaches. And finally, some of these questions might already be addressed in actual projects. I'm therefore delighted to introduce you to the 3 people that can help us shed light on these different questions and answers in this session and who will populate our panel. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Amy Tuchel, Team Leader, Climate Change, Energy and Low Carbon at ICRAF, Libby Nowicki, Soil and Land Health Leader at ICRAF as well, and Amos Wekesa, Environment and Climate Change Advisor at V Agroforestry. You will together speak on the evaluations of the impacts of local RED initiatives on forests and people. You will also give us an overview of monitoring and measuring soil organic carbon. And finally, you will also enlighten us on an actual project that has been implemented in Kenya and some of the lessons we can learn from there. I'm very much looking forward to hear and to learn from each of your experiences. But before we dive into the panel presentations, allow me to walk you all through this session's program. Our upcoming panel presentations will be followed by a short Q&A with the audience. Dear audience, please post your questions in the Q&A section of the Wova platform. At the end of the presentations, I will pose a few of the selected questions to each panel member. As you all have seen on the conference website, this is an interactive session. That means that we, after the first panel discussion, will jointly explore with you, the audience, the typical soil organic carbon project chain, from the scoping phase to the ultimate payout disbursement, and the challenges and solutions that can emerge along the way. My colleague Bruno will be your guide for this interactive part. Afterwards, we will return to our panel for some reflections before concluding. With no further ado then, I would now like for us to dive into the first panel discussion. I have asked each panelist to bring one slide or picture that represents their personal connection to addressing some of the questions that I posed earlier. Dear Amy, I would like to ask you to go first. What image have you brought and what is your story behind it? Please, Amy, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, very much. And thank you for TMG for organizing this session. So just a clarification, I'm from CIFOR, which is the Center for International Forestry Research based in Indonesia. But we are undergoing a merger process with ICRAF. So we're becoming closer and closer every day. And the image that I've brought today is really focused on RED+. And Sarah, I think as you very nicely introduced, there's so much to learn from RED+ for future restoration and soil carbon sequestration projects. And CIFOR since 2009 has conducted our global comparative study on RED+. You can see the link at the bottom of the screen if you want to learn more about that long-term project. We've been evaluating the progress and early impacts of RED+ initiatives at national, subnational, and local levels. And as you said, I think, we have not yet seen the kinds of reversals in deforestation trends that we would have hoped when RED, launched over a decade ago. But we have seen a lot of intermediate outcomes from these initiatives at multiple levels, including enhanced forest and land use monitoring capacity, increased engagement of different ministries and sectors in the national level discussions around forests. And then also an increased voice for Indigenous peoples and local communities through the whole no rights, no RED calls early on and the safeguards that came shortly thereafter. So I will focus today on the piece of CIFOR's research that focuses on the local level because we are talking about project level. I would like to say that there is a ongoing issue here of the role of projects, especially since, RED+ is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, and the idea is that RED+ will happen at jurisdictional scales, whether those are national or subnational, sort of holistic scale across an entire country or state province, at the subnational level. So the issue here is, a lot of projects, in fact, emerged in 2007 when there was the UNFCCC COP in Bali calling for demonstration activities, and really hundreds of these projects emerged across the tropics. And as of 2018, there were about 350 still active REDD+ projects in 53 countries. C4 hosts the international database on REDD+ projects and programs. It's IDRECO. You can just Google that and you will find that. It's information about those 350 projects, and we're currently updating that information this year. But so we focused since 2010 on 22 of these local REDD initiatives. And you can see them on the map here in Peru, Brazil, Cameroon, Tanzania, Vietnam, and Indonesia. They're a mix of projects and programs. So some are actually, in fact, more jurisdictional programs, like the state of Acre in Brazil, which is the whole state, or the Barao program in Indonesia, which is an entire district. And we looked at these 22 initiatives. We looked in 150 villages and 4,000 households. And really importantly, and this is why I chose this slide, because I think the design of this study has been really important. There's been very little real impact assessment of REDD+, much less than we had hoped when this first started. And if you can see the design that we used, it's a quasi-experimental design where you have control villages and households, and you have intervention villages and households in a before and after design, so that you can actually assess impact in a more rigorous way. And we were looking at the impacts of different types of REDD+ interventions, both on forest conservation using spatial data, but also on local livelihoods. So measuring income, assets, tenure security, people's own perceptions of how their well-being had changed. Our before period was 2010. Our after period, we interviewed all of these villagers and women's groups and households in 2010. We went back to the same villages and households in 2014. And then in fact, we conducted a third round of after in 2018 to get at some of the more long-term impacts. Because again, it takes a really long time for these kinds of things to show effects on the ground. So I'll just talk through some of our very key results. We really have 4 that I think are worth highlighting. They're not on the screen, so you just have to bear with me as I talk through them. We saw some reduced tree cover loss at these sites. So in fact, the REDD+ initiatives were successful in reducing tree cover loss at many of these sites, even if the effects were small. The well-being effects, so effects on people's livelihoods, were in fact mixed. The effects were very small. In fact, the forest conservation effects were more pronounced. The well-being effects were both positive and negative, but much more likely to be positive when incentive components were included. So something really important about these REDD+ projects is that they're a basket of interventions. So it's not just one thing. It's not just payments for environmental services. It's land tenure clarification, it's environmental education, there's restrictions on land use. There is, some of these payments, much less than we had expected originally, and then a lot of alternative livelihood support. So if farmers are no longer allowed to clear forests for traditional agriculture, a lot of interventions trying to support new agroforestry systems, more sustainable land use practices and things like that, but that weren't conditional on actual reductions of deforestation. So I think that's important. And 2 challenges that are still clear, and I think we should take those away, for this restoration and soil carbon sequestration projects, that land tenure is still highlighted as a persistent challenge. Sarah, you mentioned that, but I think importantly for us, that was a key result, because the proponents of these projects really focused a lot on land tenure and land tenure clarification, knowing that it was a challenge. And we really saw very little effect of those efforts in terms of enhancing tenure security. And I think that makes sense. The scale of a project, it's really hard to have that that kind of effect on changing tenure security. And the other challenge is that there's clearly more attention to gender needed. So we looked at village groups and women's only groups, and there was less understanding of these projects in the women's group. There was less participation in decision making, and in some cases there were even reports of decreased well-being in these after periods of the women's groups because of some of these interventions. So I think clear attention to gender, and a lot of groups are working on this. UN Red, for example, has a very strong gender component, but the more that we can really mainstream these gender issues in these projects and understanding, that villages are heterogeneous. There are in terms of wealth, but also in terms of women and men and ethnicity, and really trying to understand the complexity of these local level conditions. So I'll just end there. I would say that I hope that, I'm very excited by all of the attention on restoration. It's absolutely key to achieving climate and development goals. I just hope that we don't lose sight of all of the learning and actually infrastructure that has been built around REDD+ at national, subnational, and local levels, and that could in fact be leveraged as we move forward into a new generation of projects that are focused more on restoration of degraded lands. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for these very exciting insights into some of the lessons you've learned from the implementation of these REDD+ projects. I retain that indeed attention to gender and land rights remains a big problem. And we also saw in the previous session that, of course, the heterogeneity of both projects and project interventions, as well as local communities and situations on the ground, do make it interesting, but also challenging to advance and upscale some of these lessons learned and also some of the efforts. Thank you so much. I would like to immediately give the floor to Amy and to follow, to Lee, and for you, Lee, to follow up a little bit with what we can learn from some of the newest advancements in monitoring. Lee, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Amy, for setting the stage and really taking the opportunity to learn from REDD+ and learn from large-scale restoration projects in order to, place soil at the center or a key ingredient of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So I think definitely, so my name is Lee Winowicki. I'm a soil system scientist at ECRAF and C4 ECRAF, and I've spent the last almost 20 years literally digging in the soil across many continents. And some of the things that I'll talk about today are from my experience and also learning from REDD+ on the real need, as Amy already mentioned, for setting consistent baselines, for consistent monitoring, and allowing us to track multiple ecosystem health indicators and understanding how these ecosystem indicators really influence each other, and especially when we're talking about soil organic carbon. And so when we talk about indicators, we like to think about what characteristics these indicators should have. So at ECRAF, we believe that these should have, be science-based. They should be readily measurable. So that means they should be quantifiable. They also need to be rapid in a sense that we're providing real-time information to projects, to farmers, to team members, and that these should be based on field assessments across multiple scales. So we need to understand how interventions at a farm or plot scale then influence the landscape and region. And this is a really key lesson, is that these indicators need to be representative of the complex processes of land degradation, of building soil health across the landscape, so that we are able to look at drivers of degradation and really look at how the interventions we're implementing are, for example, impacting soil organic carbon. And as Amy already mentioned, C4ECRAF, we really, these are science-based institutes that are dedicated to data-driven networks. So as Amy mentioned, the enormous database on the REDD+, we also host the largest database of georeference ecosystem health indicators, all collected using a systematic framework. So here it's the LDSF framework, Land Degradation Surveillance Framework. And this has been applied in over 43 countries and assessing 100 square kilometer landscapes. And we have over 250 of these that are being monitored. And so it's, as Amy also pointed out, it's very important that we take these lessons learned, and from looking at the data and already using this framework to assess, it's clear that yes, we can influence soil health. We can influence soil organic carbon storage through management practices. And I think this gives us some hope, and this places soil as a really key resource in the UN decade, because we can influence soil health through management. And a key management practice is this idea that we need to curb soil erosion in order to start building soil health. And I hope everyone here celebrated World Soil Day, and the theme was to stop erosion. So this is a very important management practice. And that the second key message is that we can, and we now have the tools, and as Sarah alluded, that Bruno will be talking about digital tools, that we have the data analytics now in 2020 to combine these robust and systematic field surveys with remote sensing, using advanced data analytics to finally produce accurate and relevant maps to smallholders, to project managers, to governments at multiple levels of key indicators at the scale necessary to make further decisions. So thank you so much for inviting me on the panel, and very happy to contribute to the discussion and also talk more about soil and all of the benefits from restoring and maintaining and building soil health for the UN decade.
Thank you very much, Lee, for this insight. I would like to also briefly check if Amos is already with us, the third speaker for this session. Amos? So I think we have not have Amos yet among us. So therefore, I would like to maybe, while we are waiting for Amos to join us, immediately pick up on some of the questions posed by our audience to either of your presentations, Amy and Lee. And I have a first question for Lee. So could you, thank you so much for enlightening us on some of the monitoring approaches and some of the lessons learned from your monitoring framework. But could you also tell us, for example, some of the lessons that you have learned from the soil organic carbon certification process? What has worked in some of the certification projects and what has not worked?
Sure. So briefly, I can say that I'm currently on the VERA, which is the key certifiers. They're having a very active working group on how to overcome some of the bottlenecks of soil carbon certification in agricultural landscapes. And so it's a very interesting question, because I think the Miro board, or the board we'll be using later, will really get at some of the different challenges at different stages in the project. And what we were discussing in our working group lately is about, how to motivate farmers to stay in these projects when the time frame is 10 to 30 years, right, for the certification schemes. And for building soil health, it is important that we have this long-term investment from land managers, but it also means that there's a real need for commitment for farmers to engage for that long time period. So I think that it's very important that we also have these other ecosystem services that are rapid for the farmers to receive the benefits. For example, increased soil fertility and brings increased productivity, also can be enhanced by crop diversity and farming practices. So there really needs to be this kind of phased approach where you have benefits coming in year one and then carrying on through that 10-year lifespan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amy. Okay, that's sorry. I am very sorry about this confusing of the names. Thank you very much, Lee. And would you advise then that soil organic carbon projects need to take this accounting into account from the very beginning of their design, and how could they then best do that?
Yeah, so a very important component of the accounting is the monitoring, and it's probably the most favorite topic of all people engaged in a favorite topic of people engaged in this community, because if we need to have methods that are able to monitor and track carbon to detect change. And that's why it's so important that these are robust and they are operating at multiple scales and are rapid, because the idea is that we want to see an increase in carbon over time, which means that we need to have the methods and have the accuracy of the maps and the monitoring to happen right at the beginning. And so what a lot, and I think this is also what Amy mentioned in terms of REDD+, is there needs to be this robust baseline setting at the beginning of any project, especially when you're talking about soil carbon, and so that we are able to track it over time. And that is a requirement of these standards, is that there needs to be a baseline, but then how that baseline is set is still often flexible, and that's why they've started this working group, so we can have more consistent methods and hopefully use, as Bruno says, the tools available to us in 2020. We don't need to rely on age-old soil type maps that were very detailed descriptions, but maybe not suited for actually tracking and monitoring. And we have, tools for data analytics. So it's a really exciting time, and I think it's constantly evolving. So I think my second recommendation is that we need to allow for flexibility to allow the advancements in monitoring to take place. So we need to be able to incorporate the advancements in the monitoring. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Lee. I would like to pick up on this flexibility that you just mentioned yourself. And I also would like to then come back to some of the things you said, Amy. How do you see that an adaptive design can serve the implementation of soil organic carbon projects? You said, you both actually mentioned the long time it takes to show the effects on the ground, both in terms of soil organic carbon improvement, but also in terms of livelihood benefits. So how can projects be actually adaptive along the way? Is there certain features that can make it more adaptive? And what can we learn from some of the projects and studies that you have supervised, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, a couple points. I think, Lee put it very nicely, the amount of time this takes. And I think that's something we certainly saw with REDD+, is that it has taken so long. And actually a lot of the farmers at these project sites where we worked have expressed extreme frustration about the lack of benefits in some cases, or the slow benefits. And, and some of that was sort of beyond the control of the implementers, because the financial flows were simply not there in the way that they were, hoped to be 10 years ago. So, as we know, sort of the voluntary carbon market, sort of a minimal share of the finance, and that's growing. I mean, I think that's sort of what's changing now, is that there are some real benefits now for some of these private sector and civil society implementers, as well as government implementers. Even in the last year, we've seen massive change around that. And so there's sort of a re-energizing of a lot of these programs and projects on the ground because of increased financial flows. I mean, in terms of adaptive management, one thing is just having real incentives for farmers. I think that can't be understated, that it's actually at that level. And we really saw that with the well-being benefits. It's where you have the real incentives, these things are actually making a difference and motivating people to engage. And I think the other point that we really saw is that the more involved villagers and farmers are in design aspects and implementation aspects. I mean, it's sort of basic. We've been talking about this for a long time, the importance of participatory approaches, and but the more that farmers actually have a say in the design and implementation of these initiatives, it can't be understated, because then there's a real buy-in and a real sort of co-production of things that are really affecting their lives. And, especially in REDD+, I mean, if you're asking people to restrict forest clearing, and in some cases, this is generations old practice, especially in terms of Sweden agriculture. And, there has to be benefits to farmers if they're being asked to massively change practices. So I think that's an important point. And then I guess the second thing that I didn't say, and I think I need to say it at some point, is that the idea of linking to carbon markets. There was much less sale of carbon credits from REDD+ projects than was originally anticipated. And I think this is an important reality check, in fact. And that's why the financial flows were low. And then the incentives to farmers were less. And something really important, as private sector also increasingly engages in forest carbon projects, we can't lose sight of the fact that countries at the end of the day are, have their NDC targets, and every project, in fact, needs to be nested into these higher level climate change mitigation strategies. And there's a very nice blog, it's Lucio Pedroni and Donna Lee wrote about on Ecosystem Marketplace about the shades of REDD+ and comparing nesting local projects to a piece of Swiss cheese. So the projects are actually the holes in the Swiss cheese that you can't have double accounting. So you actually have to remove the emissions reduced from projects in the overall accounting. At the same time, projects are a way for different kinds of actors to engage in mitigation. And so there is this opportunity, in fact, with nesting, but that's, again, connecting to Lee's point about baselines, and especially baselines for measuring carbon emissions reductions. Those need to be aligned between project scale and subnational national scale, or you're going to have really difficulties in accounting and rewarding beneficiaries for reductions in emissions.
Thank you so much for elaborating further on those 2 points. I would like to pick up on your point on the design and the co-production, and also the co-design and co-implementation of the initiatives. And now we have Amos among us, and I think his talk will neatly also provide some insights to that aspect of both of your talks. Amos, can you hear me? Then I would like to...
Sarah, I'm here.
Hi,
I don't know why I'm taken as a private participant here. Sorry.
Very much welcome to our session. We've gone ahead and answered already some questions from the audience while we were waiting for you, but you joined us at a perfect time, and you have the floor, and I would like you to present to us the slide that you have prepared and tell us more about the work of the agroforestry and the projects in Kenya. You have the floor, Amos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for giving me this opportunity, and the other participants. I would like also to recognize my colleagues from the agroforestry in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. They are here, and also our partners whom we work together on implementing projects on the ground. So I'll only mention here the Kenya Agriculture Carbon Project. This project is actually focusing on fighting poverty, but also climate, because both poverty and climate change are problems that are interrelated, and we are using this carbon offsetting project to fight that. Next slide. Can you see my screen? Yes. So this Kenya Agriculture Carbon Project is in Western Kenya, in different agroecological zone, in highlands of Kitale, that's Western Mount Elgon region, and lowlands of Lake Victoria in Kisumu region. They have different climatic zones of 350 millimeters of rainfall to 1800 millimeters of rainfall. So this carbon project was put in different agroecological zones to see, because the soil types are also different in that area. This project was started in 2009, and here the project was co-developed by CEDA, who are the financiers. The Viacro Forest also financed, and the Biocarbon Fund was the buyer and also financed technical capacity development, which financed Unique Forestry land use organization to help us design and develop this project. And the project is working in farming system or mixed system, smallholder farmers who has land less than 1 hectare, and they have mixed cropping system, but dominated with maize farming system. So the project is targeting soil carbon and also biomass from trees. So far, we've targeted around 1,730 farmer groups who had implemented sustainable agricultural land management practices on their farms, about 22,000 hectares. Then this project is using a methodology approved by Vera Standard on voluntary carbon marketing. The methodology is called adoption of sustainable agricultural land management, which are simple practices like those practices that increase organic carbon input into the soil. For example, manure application, composting, terracing, agroforestry, simple practices that farmers already know, are designed and adopted on the farms. The aim of the project is actually to increase food security, because we believe when you increase soil organic matter or carbon, you increase you increase a reservoir for storage of nutrients. And there are also nutrient practices like cover crops, and those practices that enhance soil fertility, they are also adopted here. So there are different practices that farmers choose, around 9 of them. And these practices are the one that increases soil organic carbon, which is measured with a rigor kind of monitoring system that is called activity-based modeling. So we just look at the activity of the farmer, we get the GPS of the farms, we calculate the information based on the farmer and the yields the farmer has, and then we send through mobile farm system. and we monitor annually on that. So far, we have adopted practice on farms, and around 22,000 farms, hectares, they have, for the last 7 years, have sequestered 300,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which was measured and compensated to farmers because giving farm at least $4 per ton of carbon, and this money was distributed with a fair distribution plan to farms. So around 30,000 farmers have received carbon credits, and their yields on farms had increased, especially maize yields, and farmers earned this money, and this money helped them to plow back to the farm. So maybe I rush to share with you about the challenges we have. The running costs are high. The implementation costs are high. It requires huge investment in project monitoring structures. They require a high cost of verification because verify are not local. They are external in professionals and bodies. Also requires investment in marketing the credits. So there's a running cost challenge, and also the people here it might not be the interest of the right holders, who are the farmers, because the interest for farmers here is actually the yields, the crops, the food, and their soil sustainability. But when you come maybe for the carbon, it's just to help them adopt these practices that improve their economic capitals. It requires also time to monitor, and there's also risk of becoming a production unit of carbon. It has a gender element, so you need to address the gender equality issue. It also, because of land tenure and resource tenure system on farms, engagement during less intensive phase, it requires someone, an organization, local organization, to take up and sustain this farm for a long term, because using the implementation money will only last for 5 years or 10 years. So you leave the project to the community. It requires intensive phase also. Project developers, those who want to develop such a projects in Kenya are few, and scaling up is a challenge. Via Agroforest took this as their passion, because the aim of us doing this, it was adding value to our agroforestry development and sustainable land management practices. So this project to us is added value, but other implementers, we've tried to work with other people to take up and scale up to other areas. It's been a challenge. I think that's the challenges we have, but also I had the lessons that we've learned in this project, which I also like to share quickly. Upfront investment is important. You need money to invest in this, especially in extension, so that the farmers can adopt, especially from private sector and public extension services. Local expertise key. You need to develop local capacity of organizations so that they take up. Institutional capacity development is critical for implementation, even in terms of institutions or policy or laws or rules of the country, maybe along sustainable agriculture. They are very important. Carbon markets incentives are important. You need a carbon market incentives from the top to pay farmers the carbon credits. To us, we pay as a bonus on top of other benefits, because you need the core benefits, the one that runs the project. Monitoring is important. You need to invest money in monitoring and modeling so that you can really show carbon credits or carbon emission reduction are quantifiable. And sustainability is important, and gender equality. I think I'll stop there at this point, and maybe if I have a question from the floor. Thank you,
Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you, Amos, for walking us through that project and your experiences, and also highlighting already some of the challenges, but also some of the areas to pay particular attention to, and where potential solutions might lie. This brings us neatly to the interactive part of this session, where we will together look at the different stages of a project, and also further building on some of the challenges that either one of our three panelists have highlighted, together with the audience explore solutions to address these and potentially also other challenges. I will, Amos, I would love to pose you a question from the audience. We perhaps have time in the second part of our panel discussion after our interactive part. So I will hand over the floor to my colleague Bruno now, who will walk you through the exercise.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, Bruno, hi.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for your contributions. Thanks, Amy, first of all, for this plaidoyer in learning from the experiences of REDD+ and for using the infrastructure and networks that are already in place for future initiatives. Also, thanks, Lee, for highlighting some exciting developments in monitoring technologies. And of course, to you, Amos, for highlighting some of the challenges the agroforestry has been facing in the implementation of the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project. As my colleague Sarah mentioned, my name is Bruno Saint-Jacques, and I'm working at TMG Research as part of the Zero Lab project. I will be guiding you through this interactive section of our session, where we will explore a carbon sequestration archetypal project chain. With many projects in agricultural landscapes striving to provide healthy food and water, increase economic returns for farmers, and protect biodiversity, one of the guiding questions around this session really revolves around how climate financing for soil carbon can actually bring additional revenue to these efforts. With this session, we therefore hope to exchange experiences between professionals who are working on carbon sequestration to identify how projects can not only involve, but truly benefit small-scale farmers. For us to get a better understanding of the big picture, we have created an infographic where we conceptualize carbon sequestration projects as a chain broken down in different components. You should now be able to see the chain in your screen. We want to gaze at those different components and determine how they can be improved, while at the same time keeping in mind that every component is actually part of an interconnected ensemble. To be sure, this conceptualization as a chain does not imply that soil carbon sequestration can be summarized as a technical challenge. As mentioned earlier by my colleague Sarah, underlying social, political, and institutional structures can either support or hinder certain social groups or communities from engaging or benefiting from projects. There is therefore a need to work towards addressing the structural hindrances and create an enabling environment for smallholder farmers to benefit from carbon sequestration projects. As Amos just mentioned during his presentation, projects have shown that for many smallholder farmers, productivity benefits are what matters most, with climate mitigation and carbon payments representing a bonus or an extra benefit. Fostering the adoption of sustainable land management practices through behavioral change on the side of farmers therefore needs to hinge on communicating how increasing the soil organic carbon in the soils actually provide co-benefits at multiple levels. As mentioned in similar sessions about soil organic carbon, there are multiple conversations about using the potential of digitalization for upscaling and reducing transaction costs across the whole chain. There's a plethora of digital solutions for monitoring, for extension services, for finance, and for market access, and we need to find ways to truly harness their potential. We are eager to learn more about your experiences on that level as well, and we will actually be able to learn about those experiences a bit later in the session. So let's inspect the project chain together. So the first step of the chain, scoping and assessment, is to assess the feasibility of a project, estimate the sequestration potential, and identify the eligible practices that farmers will adopt. One of the core challenges of such projects are the high transaction costs of the necessary infrastructure to facilitate the creation and exchange of carbon credits. Implementation, verification, and marketing carbon credits is highly time and cost intensive, and there is an important need for pre-financing, as Amos mentioned earlier. Moreover, projects involving smallholder farmers represent an extra challenge since the cost per hectare and per unit of carbon sequestration is actually higher with small-scale projects than large-scale ones. So as many actors in the field mentioned, scale is a crucial issue in this area, and finding ways to further aggregate smallholder farmers into larger farm organizations will be key to upscaling initiatives in the future. Moving on to the second step, the accounting methodology. This step consists of determining which accounting methodology to use for the project by comparing between available methodologies against local practices that can actually contribute to significant carbon gains. There are now different methodologies linking sustainable land management and carbon sequestration, of which the VERA methodology used in the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project, as well as the more recent gold standard Soil Organic Carbon Framework are examples. Accounting methodologies are essential in creating the necessary trust underpinning the whole enterprise. And of course, one of the core challenges to achieve impact is linked to those methodologies, namely to the accuracy and validity of them. Uncertainty regarding the permanence of the carbon in soils, as well as the difficulties to measure the soil organic carbon increases, are only examples of challenges within those methodologies. Also, market-based mechanisms penalize uncertainty, which means that estimates need to be as precise as possible while considering the inverse relationship between precision and cost. Now let's move on to the project design, where project developers need to identify all potential activities, establish carbon baseline scenarios, and define and assure principles of operation. So the project design document, or PDD, to make it even more technical, is often a long and technically dense document, as an implications on the volume of emissions reductions that a project will potentially generate. A central question is, how can we ensure that those documents are sufficiently sensitive to local context or adaptive to changing local conditions, needs, and priorities? Of course, more participatory processes in the development of projects would actually be able to create initiatives that are more apt at identifying farmers' needs and building trust between project developers and communities. For example, a digital platform containing all needed information and enabling access to relevant market actors and stakeholders would represent something quite promising at this level. So once the project document is elaborated, the project actually has to be validated, which is usually conducted by a third-party audit. So the core challenges at this level are really to increase the capacity of project developers to navigate the necessary requirements of different certification and validation schemes. Filling up, submitting, and correcting project documents is a time-consuming process, and finding ways to alleviate this process without compromising on the quality and robustness of the validation would be, of course, extremely helpful. Once the project is validated, we need to take care of the monitoring and evaluation system, where project developers and related actors will develop systems for data collection and train the project staff. The core challenges related to monitoring are linked to the high investments needed to build monitoring structures and also the high burden that is felt on farmers. A strong engagement and prior education of farmers is important, and carbon sequestration projects need to provide long-term services to farmers and work with local groups to build up the trust. One way that has been suggested in improving monitoring and evaluation systems is to actually institutionalize the soil organic carbon monitoring into broader practices and share this monitoring across location. Digital advisory services, mobile apps, and integrated management information systems have the potential to reduce the transaction costs involved in this step of the chain. Once the monitoring is established and the carbon credits issued, we can now move to the next step in the chain, which is the carbon credits trading, which is related, of course, to identifying the buyer, signing purchase agreements, and booking the actual transactions. Needless to say that finding a broker or a buyer is fundamental to the success of a project. Different types of credits attract different buyers, and the demand for carbon credits thus depends on the quality with which these credits are perceived in terms of timing, certification process, and quantities. A core challenge is linked to the uncertainty of carbon markets. On the one hand, prices in the voluntary markets are highly volatile, and there's a lack of an established market price, but also marketplace. More efforts have to be made at identifying potential buyers, linking supply and demand of carbon credits from the beginning of projects onwards. Tapping into domestic offsetting markets and private sector schemes, for example, such as the Corsia scheme of the aviation industry, represent one potential avenue. Finally, the decision on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is still pending, and it's still unsure if soil organic carbon will be part of the soon-to-be-developed mechanism. However, almost all nationally determined contributions, the so-called NDCs, do reference agriculture, either in the mitigation section or in the adaptation section, or more often, even in both sections, which suggests that the agricultural sector is perhaps well placed to lead the way for emissions trading mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Finally, going back to the last step of the chain, the payments disbursements. This is the final step where carbon payments are actually dispersed to smallholder farmers according to the modalities contained in the project documents. We wish to emphasize that carbon sequestration projects imply a big burden on farmers, with productivity benefits not immediate. As we learned from Amos earlier and by looking through the literature on carbon sequestration projects, agricultural productivity increases only for the second or the third year onwards in certain projects, which puts additional pressure on farmers' livelihoods, especially for the most vulnerable. A core challenge identified in projects is related to the scheduling and timing of payments disbursements. It can take sometimes 2 to 5 years between the payment agreement and the actual transfer to farmers, which means that farmers cannot predict and orientate the activities around potential disbursement. Again, at this level, digital solutions could potentially play a role. For example, having a smart infrastructure to distribute financial benefits and potentially finance or refinance other project inputs could be quite useful. So this was my overview of the carbon project chain. I hope it was helpful for you to grasp the complexity of such initiatives, but also keep the big picture in your mind. I have already outlined some challenges and solutions related to each component of the chain, and we would now like to invite all of you to provide your input and thoughts about additional challenges and solutions. It's now time to get interactive. So how are we going to make this work? We would like to collect the input in the Q&A section on the Wova platform. We would greatly appreciate if, when inputting information, you could, 1, mention the component of the project chain your input is about, and 2, sign your comment with your name. This would be greatly helpful for us to gather the input and get in touch with the participants at a later stage. So the way for you to be interactive is by inputting information in the Q&A section, the same way you address questions to the panelists earlier. This Q&A section can be found on the right side in the Wova platform. I hope everyone is ready, and to begin with, I would like to invite you to provide one thought on potential challenges related to the carbon sequestration project chain. Please write your input in the Q&A, and again, don't forget to 1, mention the component of the project chain your input is about, and 2, sign your comment with your name. So we will now allow 5 minutes for this input. So we are already gathering some input here in the Q&A box. So if it's not clear for everyone, I would just like to repeat the instructions. Please input some of your thoughts about the challenges related to carbon sequestration projects, if you are aware of any, and input them in the Q&A box on the right side of the Wova platform. We will still allow a few minutes for this input on your side in order to be interactive. Hi, everyone. So we will still allow a few minutes for your input. So if you are aware of any challenge related to carbon sequestration projects, also to broader topic related to soil organic carbon, please feel free to input this challenge in the Q&A box within the Wova platform, and we will take this information and collect it to inform our future activities and distribute it with you at a later stage. Okay. Now I would like to ask you if you could provide any input on potential solutions to some of the challenges you might have identified within carbon sequestration projects. So any idea regarding the project feasibility, the project development, the monitoring, the carbon trading, farmers aggregation, any idea, any component or subcomponent of the project chain, any potential solutions you are aware of, please share it with us because we're very curious to hear about it. And please do so in the Q&A box on the right side of the platform, if possible. We will allow a few more minutes for input before moving on to the next portion of our session. And I would like to thank everybody who's been posting input so far. There are already some interesting comments in there. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone, again, for inputting some information in there. I can already see here that in terms of the scoping phase, the aggregation of smallholder farmers is definitely a challenge. In terms of the trading, we have a contribution by Ingo Böttcher saying that trading certificates is crucial and that long-term preservation must be guaranteed. Otherwise, it is not sustainable. Definitely. And we also have input saying that what are the options to reduce costs for monitoring and verification? So there are a few questions also coming up in the Q&A. So I will now hand it over to Sarah to redirect some of the questions to further up the discussion between the panelists as they are the experts on some of those components.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Indeed, some very interesting questions and reflections that we are getting from the audience. And I'm just trying to digest here also myself the many questions and also suggestions we have been receiving. Perhaps I would like to come back to my earlier promise to Amos that I would give him the floor to also answer some of the questions coming from the audience. Some some challenges can be overcome, for example, by having or rethinking or working together with extension services in the projects. Can you give us a little more insight, Amos, on what the role of extension services can be and how they can actually reduce some of the transaction costs and also make it easier for farmers and for communities to get ready to engage in these projects and also to benefit from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Bruno, for that session, and audience for asking questions. I found extension is key for mobilizing farmers and transferring knowledge and also monitoring and sustaining. Extension is still key because we also use technology in this field, for example, for transmission of information from the farms. We are using mobile phones. Another thing that is important is you make the project be commodity-based, carbon value chain. You don't just go to talk about environmental conservation without economic sense in the project. For example, this project we are talking about subsistence farming, improving maize yield, beans and sorghum, but also in Mount Elgon project where we are having a private sector dairy processor with Brookside coming in to enhance the business angle of the dairy. And then farmers adopting sustainable agriculture practices and agroforestry on the farms to increase yields of the farm and also improve dairy production. So we went with the dairy component as a business thing to the farmer because farmer need money. So that extension goes like you are having 3 projects in one: the dairy, the business, and the sustainable practices for carbon. So when you are scaling up the project, you need to bring in the economic sense so that you leverage on the extension, so that extension services are broader than just single. Cooperation and partnership is important. When you work together as in partnership, and also you make farmer to farmer learning, because we are using community facilitators as trainers to train themselves on some component, while the extension officer help, because we are seeing like extension officer can work comfortably with around 2,000 farmers because we cannot oversupply extension because it's costly. So that enhancing farmer group approach, there are many local extension practices that farmers themselves can train one another. You can have radio program, you can have women groups learning together, and some local representatives. I think when we use farmers themselves and CBOs and farmer groups in terms of institutional capacity development, that will reduce the extension transaction cost, because that transaction, the extension was the biggest, because we started with this project with 35 extension officers, and we used around 1.5 million US dollars for 5 years running this project, and we got very little carbon in the start. So this project, for you to start bringing money that you invested in, it breaks even at 10 years to bring the money you have invested when you are selling carbon credits. So in the short term, you have more investment in extension, and extension was the biggest user of the money. So I think it's about partnership, it's about cooperative movement, it's about business, it's about working together.
Thank you so much, Amos, for clarifying that point and for also clearly outlining how extension services can be closer involved. You mentioned that the extension, so most of the money in the beginning goes to extension services, and this brings me again to the long lifetime of these projects. And I would like to pick up on this and move over to Amy with a follow-up question. Have you, in your study, come across people leaving the schemes? The big challenge is to keep farmers motivated for 10, 20 years. Many farmers are old and might not live or to really reap the benefits of some of the project activities. And also, what has been your experience with youth? Are they more motivated, or is it actually are the opportunity costs for them and other income opportunities actually more interesting? Amy, if you could briefly react to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've sort of said it. I think the there are groups that are ending their participation in these kinds of initiatives when the benefits that were promised to them are not realized. I think that's very natural, especially if it's 5 to 10 years after those benefits were promised and not actually delivered. So yeah, I mean, we did see that quite a bit, in fact. And I think you know, it's interesting, your question about youth, and we didn't examine that specifically, but I think that is another important aspect. I mean, we were really looking at mostly differences between men and women participation in these kinds of initiatives, but that is critically important, especially sort of the next generation of laborers and land users and landholders. And I think that is, again, I think it just gets back to this point that really genuine participation in the design, implementation, and decision-making of REDD+ projects is still a frontier. While we've seen some initiatives do better than others, it's still not where it needs to be in terms of local engagement. And you are going to lose motivation and participation if people are not truly engaged in and benefiting from these kinds of initiatives.
Okay, thank you so much. Picking up on some other areas and suggestions from the audience, I would like to pose a question now to you, Lee. And would you say that based on actual monitoring of soil organic carbon, farmers actually identify enough incentives for them to also engage in some of the activities from the project?
Great. Thanks so much for the opportunity and a really interesting feedback from the participants. One very fortunate thing about soil is that you can easily see and experience the benefits. It's not some very difficult reading the air type benefit. You can actually see the benefits in your soil. You can see the life coming back. You can see the productivity of the rangelands, of the trees, of the agricultural products increasing. And so I think that there's so much potential to implement these projects in terms of scaling. And my comment I'd like to build on what Amy was saying. In addition to the youth aspect, when you're implementing these projects, what we have found is the importance of acknowledging the agency of men and women in the decision making for the implementation. And we have lovely blogs and lots of brochures on how restoration options can really influence the agency of women, men, and youth in these interventions And it really comes down to what was mentioned at the beginning of this seminar, is how you engage with them at the beginning of these projects in terms of design, in terms of feedback, and in terms of really allowing farmers to innovate. There is no silver bullet. And even Amos was mentioning a whole slew of potential interventions. There's no silver bullet. And even within those interventions, as mentioned by Susan Chomba in the beginning session, tree planting, for example, it's about how we're planting the trees, which trees we're planting, and the use. So really allowing the farmers, he, she, the whole community to innovate the interventions is key. And then they can visually see the benefits of building their soil, of tailoring the intervention for their particular context. At eCrop, we call it the options by context approach. So I think it's exciting, and just it could be a challenge, but it's an opportunity. If we want to do landscape restoration, if we want to increase soil organic carbon, ecosystem restoration, that means we must be working with thousands of farmers. We cannot work on demonstration plots. We cannot work with 10 farmers. It needs to be thousands of farmers across the landscape to really have an impact. And I think that requires all of us as the community, that we need to work together, scientists, with development partners, with governments, Amos mentioned extension, so that we're all together working on these common goals and implementation to improve soil and ecosystem restoration. Thanks for the question, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Lee. That also neatly connects with what Tim Christopherson earlier said in the first session, namely that action on the ground is here one of the most important parts, and that all those actors out there can use the support they can get through the strategy on restoration, UN Decade on ecosystems restoration, but also various different other projects. We, in the first session, had Martin Jemefak as one of the speakers, and unfortunately he could not be with us, but I have been told that he now is with us here, but that his internet connection is actually not permitting him to make his statement or to read out what he had prepared. So therefore, we have now been communicating with him, and my colleague Jess Weigelt, our head of programs here at TMG, will now briefly read a part of Martin's statement, which should also connect with some of the discussions we've had both in the first session, but also in this session. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you all for participating. Everybody who knows me speaking on soil organic carbon is a little bit of far-fetched, but I hope I'll do justice to Professor Jemefak's contributions. And in fact, what he has offered and submitted to us as a written statement is in fact a valuable contribution to the discussion that we had so far, because he's emphasizing the role of soil organic carbon for adaptation purposes and not only for mitigation purposes. We tend to see carbon primarily from the perspective, from a global north perspective, on how to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, whereas Professor Jemefak is emphasizing the role of adaptation. He has asked me to read out part of his paper, so that's what I'll do, and I'll try to read slowly, which is a struggle for me, but if you have the feeling that I'm getting too speedy, just let me know. And I think it is important to recognize, and this is what Professor Jemefak is doing, he's situating the whole discussion on soil organic carbon sequestration enhancements in the context of an enabling environment, or the lack of an enabling environment that smallholders have to actually practice sustainable soil use. So he mentions the unavailability of advisory services and the lack of appropriate governance instruments, and so on and so forth. So I will now turn to his text, and I would like to thank you, Professor Jemefak, for providing this valuable addition. Farmers in this environment are well aware of the possible benefits of soil organic matter content for crop productivity and perceive climate change as an increase in temperatures and decrease in rainfall, which affects livestock and food crop productions through reduction in crop yields, increased incidence of pests and diseases, increased difficulty in preparing land for cultivation, and its perturbation in planting dates. They respond to some of these effects by applying adaptation measures, such as the use of different practices to increase the soil organic matter content of their fields, the use of crop rotation or cultivated green manures, mulching, incorporating crop residues in soil, practicing of long fallow, shifting planting dates, irrigation, application of pesticides to sustain food production. However, these practices are often not affordable and might conflict with other farm objectives such as labor use efficiency and extra charges. The farmer's need for such balance can prevent the implementation of practices to increase soil organic matter content of the topsoil. In response to land degradation, a major external impact on land users' decisions may come from policies that are conducive to sustainable land management and which also encompass incentives for livelihood security. Some specific actions for preserving soil productivity in smaller farms are as follows. And actually now he establishes a very nice link to our first session. So the first specific action that he's listing is implementing development projects to scale up fertility replenishment practices. Second, developing technologies, options for integrated soil fertility management, conservation agriculture practices, agro-ecosystem management approaches to prevent and or reverse land degradation. Third, developing land use policies based on comprehensive land use planning maps and relevant modeling parameters at relevant scales. In brackets, national and decentralized land use policy formulation. Fourth, investing in community-based development projects that integrate agriculture, education, and health sectors, such as participatory climate-smart agriculture and sustainable land management, that relate improved soil management practices and the cultivation of trees, integrated farmlands, home garden agroforestry systems, communal and community forests, grazing lands, woodlots, and watersheds. In implementing such actions, the approaches to be used should be based on the following. First, and this will sound as music in Susan's ears, farmer-managed natural regeneration. 2, trees domestication, focusing on intensification of agroforestry systems. So another agrees to ICRAF. 3, development of adaptation options for livestock through improved feeding and management of grazing land, support to pastoral land development and resilience of the pastoral communities. 4, composting from biodegradable waste to produce biofertilizers as an alternative to chemical fertilizers that are often either not available, not affordable, or not effective and may negatively affect the environment. 5th, land health assessments to assess certain soil nutrient status, soil pH, and physical characteristics, as well as vegetation properties in order to provide appropriate and context-specific advice on the restoration of depleted soils. I'd like to thank Professor Yemefak for these valuable contributions. I am sure I didn't do justice to his contribution, but I hope you at least got a little of a glimpse of what he would have emphasized if he would have been with us. And maybe as a little side note for all of us, as much as the digital world is super duper, it might not be as inclusive as we want it to be, as bandwidth might not be sufficient to actually connect from all the places of this world. So thank you very much, Sarah. I'll switch off here.
Thank you, yes, for relaying Professor Yemefak's points to our session participants and also our panelists. We are running out of time. We're actually already 1 minute over time. So I will now conclude and close this session. I would like to very much thank again our 3 panelists for today, Amy, Lee, and Amos. I'm very pleased you were with us today. Thank you so much for all your valuable insights. I would also like to thank the audience for your input in the Q&A session and for brainstorming with us on the challenges, but also solutions along the different stages of the project chain. The actual exercise and the result of it will become available on the WUVA platform, and you will be able to click on it in supporting materials under these sessions. So you can all, at home, where you probably already are, take a closer look and analyze and maybe also get some new ideas by looking at the inputs and the suggestions of your fellow audience members. Thank you all so much. We will be back in 15 minutes with the third session, where we will look at some social innovations that have improved and actually combined land rights and gender access in projects in Burkina Faso. Thank you all very much, and looking forward to connecting with you soon in other settings and environments. Good afternoon, everyone. I just realized I was muted, but still a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us recently for this session, but also to all of you who have been with us since 2 o'clock this afternoon. I'm delighted to see that so many of you can participate, and I would therefore also very much like to thank the audience for the many inputs we have received during the previous 2 sessions. Now I am, as you must all be, very excited about this opportunity to learn from a number of projects that we have implemented in Burkina Faso and Kenya. I will hand over for the session to my colleague, Jess Weigelt, Head of Programs at TMG Research. Yes, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you very much for all of those attending this session. I'll have the honor to chair this session, a session that's very dear to my heart because it actually, from our point of view, establishes the link between investments in ecosystem restoration and the benefits to be received then of those women and vulnerable groups. Bruno, Matteo, may I ask you for the next slide? This is working perfect. Okay, there we go. I have 5 bullet points to kick off the session. And I think the first one was already made very strongly in the previous 2 sessions. It is in order for women to benefit from ecosystem restoration, secure rights to land are key. Of course, property rights would be the most preferable option, but also use rights, secure use rights are an alternative in case sort of handing over property rights to women is, depending on the context, sometimes a longer-term process. The second bullet is actually a response to a lot of comments that we received when we started to work on the question of linking ecosystem restoration, land and soil restoration with the question of land rights. And this response was, you cannot do that. That's way too complex. Ecosystem restoration projects are already difficult in and of themselves. Why are you even considering putting another layer of complexity on this? This can't be done. And in discussions with these project implementers, it became clear that measures to enhance tenure security of women and smallholder farmers in general were equated with large-scale land cadastre reforms or similar large-scale, let's say, recognition programs. And this need not be the case. Of course, again, it would be advisable to really have this, let's say, large-scale recognition of land rights, but the capacities to do that are simply often not there. So we need sort of these intermediate solutions, and these intermediate solutions, and that's what's captured in the second bullet point, it is possible to include these in land and soil restoration programs and in programs of ecosystem restoration. And with everything that I've already said, leads me already to the third bullet point. Often the solutions to secure the land rights of women in specific contexts are not necessarily known. And we will learn 2 very specific examples how we address the question in the context that we have worked with. And I'm very honored and glad to see my sister Violet from Western Kenya with us and my colleague Larissa, who will speak about these experiences in this session. When we have termed these locally adapted solutions social innovations are innovations that are developed taking into account the need of the female farmer, at the same time the capacities for implementation that local administration or traditional authorities do have. The fourth bullet point, and something that was really, I think, a landmark achievement, at the last conference of the parties of the UNCCD, parties to the convention have adopted a decision that reaffirms the importance of the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land in the context of land degradation neutrality and measures to combat drought desertification and land degradation. And I think this is really a strong commitment by parties in the context of the Deccan ecosystem ration, that they are serious about the link between rights to resources and ecosystem restoration. And I'm very happy that Marcos is with us to speak about it. Last but not least, we have two very able and gifted commentators who will provide their views at the end of the session. This is Lauren Cardelli, founder of A Growing Culture, and Sylvia, an ambassador of IFOAM and a successful entrepreneur in organic agriculture called Sylvia's Basket. I've included some of the details of the information that will be provided as links on the slide. The slide will be shared in the chat. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to my dear sister Violet to please share with us our experiences from Western Kenya. Violet, we have to be even more strict when it comes to timing in the virtual world, so you please check out the chat box. It might be that Matteo will give you some notes when sort of the end of your allocated time slot is approaching. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for the great panelists and commentators, and over to you, Violet.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really feel humbled to have the opportunity of participating in this meeting, which is a subject that is very important to the current trend of landscape and also to the issues around food security and climate change. As Jess says, my name is Violet. I work with a community-based organization called Shibuya Community Health Workers. Shibuya Community Health Workers is an organization that began as an HIV/AIDS response organization, but over a period of time, when we started working on issues of nutrition and food security in families affected with HIV/AIDS, we realized how women land rights was a big issue, and most of the families that were headed with women, especially widows, were losing land time to time, being thrown away by relatives. So there was great need for us to start a campaign on women land rights, which we began in 2008. So we are an organization that has been working on women land rights for some time, which relates issues relating to disinheritance, where women are thrown out of homes. And it's from this context that in 2016, we had the opportunity of meeting Sarah Giraku through the Department of Agriculture, and we sat together because there was another intervention that wasn't really addressed when it comes to the other alternative on how women can access land to be able to participate in the projects that were happening around soil rehabilitation and management, issues around climate change, and even participating in agricultural activities like the 1 Acre Fund, that is an opportunity brought by some NGOs or government. And when we looked at this, we were looking at, as we pursue women land rights through inheritance, is still a very long process, and this is not something that will address the issue of land and food security in women households in very quickly. So we actually began this project to sensitize our local authorities, and we came together with the chiefs, and we began to do a project on land leasing, which was developing community-driven land lease guidelines to enhance land leasing where youth and women would participate. Because of the time, I will not go through the process, but you can get us on the link of TMG on how the land lease guidelines are developed. I want to share the results that we have been able to achieve from this project. One is that most women and youth have been able to participate in the projects related to soil rehabilitation and management. And as an organization, Shibuya, we are among the organizations that scored very high with the other projects related to food security, where most women were participating in soil management. Women have been able to lease land as individuals and youth, including leasing land as a collective. We have had very strong collaboration with the stakeholders, and conflicts that surround land disputes have been addressed because of these land lease guidelines. And the most important achievement that we are realizing right now is that we are now in a discussion with the county government to develop the community-driven land lines to become a legal framework in Kakamega County land policy activities, because it is really addressing all the issues related to how women can participate in agriculture and even enhancing agricultural productivity. So this is a process we have begun. We have a documentary which you can also find online, where even the governor himself is speaking about this as a real intervention and a solution that will help in minimizing land conflicts and will advance agriculture productivity, and why it's important for it to become a law that can support in addressing. We are now expanded to other regions where we are sensitizing, like Homa Bay County, which were really affected with HIV/AIDS, and women were limited to accessing land because of the widowhood. We have seen how women have leased land and they're doing agricultural activities. I was there and witnessed amazing work. Like, land is not lying without people using it. Women are leasing land, conflicts have been reduced, and the number of women and youth that are now participating in agriculture, the relationship between women and the Agriculture Extension Office and even the Agriculture Department as whole and forest has really increased, because in soil rehabilitation and management, we are also doing agroforestry and all this. And the attitude of denying women to plant land, to plant trees, has actually been able to address, and that culture has been addressed. And we are now having a real collaboration in the community around land leasing. Thank you.
Thank you, Violet, for this concise yet comprehensive presentation. I'm really grateful for the work that you've done, and continue to be impressed by the results that you have achieved. There is already the first question by our participants, and this our participant is asking whether we have examples for the transfer of land rights, land use rights to women in contexts that where women still encounter challenges of accessing land. And I think thanks to your work, Violet, I think we have already demonstrated one of these examples, and hope that our participant will find inspiration in this response. There will be a second response by this, and this will be offered by my dear colleague Larissa. Larissa is project coordinator at TMG Research. Larissa, over to you. And Larissa, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess, for your kind introduction and for giving me the chance to share our experiences from Burkina Faso. I wonder, I have a presentation. Is it shown? Thank you. Thank you. So our project as a TMG is a transdisciplinary research project that is accompanying a global soil restoration program, focusing on developing local solutions to provide incentives for smallholder farmers to invest in SLM. And in Burkina Faso, land tenure security is a very serious obstacle for smallholder farmers to practice SLM, especially for women and other vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. And this graphic shows the tenure situation many women in rural Burkina Faso face, as was also pointed out by Alexander in his opening speech of session 1. So in many ethnic groups, women are allocated a plot of land to farm. Often this plot is, however, of poor soil quality. And after women have then restored the soil, it often happens that they are at risk of being withdrawn in this plot. So basically, men can withdraw women's access to land at any point in time. And this phenomenon is referred to as forced rotation, so meaning that women involuntarily rotate the fields they farm. The legal framework in Burkina Faso on land acknowledges equal rights of men and women to access land. However, implementation is advancing very slowly. So an estimated 4% of land is actually formalized in Burkina Faso. And even where the law implementation is advancing, women are still often discriminated against when registering land due to male-dominated institutions, persisting patriarchal norms, etc., and practices, etc. And SAM programs often shy away from addressing these issues. In a study we conducted at TMG in Burkina Faso, we found that actually less than a third of SAM programs we analyzed did have a component on tenure issues and land tenure in their project design. So against this background, we at TMG, together with our Burkinabe partner GRAF, have developed a process to develop social innovations in order to secure women's access to land. And this process was developed in the village of Tiarako in southwestern Burkina Faso in 2017 and 2018. And this process is basically about facilitated negotiations at community and household level, with the aim of transferring long-term and secure land use rights from men to women. And this graphic illustrates the process in a simplified manner. I will briefly go through it. So at the beginning of the process, the first step was to assemble the various and relevant stakeholders, so including the village community, local leaders, the municipal administration, the project implementers such as GIZ and other experts, and together with them to design the process. And then next step was to raise awareness, of course, about the benefits of women's equal access to land. This was followed by negotiations of tenure agreements at various levels. And then the plots to be transferred were GPS recorded in a participatory manner. And in the final step, the plots were then validated in a village assembly and with participation and support by the municipal administration. Next slide, please. So at the end of this process in Tiarako, we had more than 200 women who benefited from these land right transfers, and on an area of over 400 hectares. And next slide, please. Since March 2018, we have been monitored the outcomes of this process. And what we can see today is that indeed awareness about women's rights to land has positively changed. Tenure security has reportedly increased, meaning that the forced rotation phenomenon I was referring to in the beginning is now seen as the old method that has been abandoned. And basically, there have been so far no claims from men to withdraw the land allocated to women again. And interviewed women also reported that they are now better organized in the agricultural work. Meaning, for example, they're better organized in self-help groups. And this really shows that giving women more secure access to land can also really increase their motivation. So next and last slide. Okay. So what are the enabling factors of this process? What did it make work? There are 4 points which I would like to highlight. Our partner GRAF is a very trusted and neutral process facilitator, which was very important in addressing complex and sensitive issues such as land governance. The process is built on consensus building within the community. There were lots of village assemblies. And then third, due to the strong involvement of the various actors and the political support by local leaders and the municipal administration, there was a very strong sense of ownership. And finally, and most importantly, given the transparency of this process, the respect of local customs and existing tenure relations, legitimacy of these tenure arrangements was ensured. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Larissa, for the contribution. I think in particular, the last point we will get back to in the Q&A session, because the question of legitimacy and how to arrange for legitimacy is a question that is popping up quite a bit in the Q&A box. We have now listened to two successful but very local examples. And from our point of view, from TMG research point of view, it is when these local successful initiatives match global windows of opportunities that often then progress can really result. And that's why I'm very grateful that Marcus is with us. Marcus is a trusted colleague from UNCCD, head of the NGO branch there, and was actually the key person behind the decision at the COP14 UNCCD last September. So Marcus, over to you. Please share your perspective on this topic with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, yes, and thank you so much also to my fellow presenters here, because we have seen what at the local level is possible to do in order to protect the land. When we are talking about the land, we are talking about many things. We are talking about food security. We are talking about the access to the natural resources that the land holds. We are talking about poverty. So for us, for this convention, is really important the way we are managing the land. That's why the UNCCD was put into place to promote this sustainable land management, to avoid the land degradation caused by climatic variations or human activities. But it's really interesting to see that since, well, this convention last year was our 25th anniversary. There were already many conferences of the parties where those parties and countries that are members to the convention were discussing the main topics. The issue of land tenure and land governance was not discussed in depth, and we didn't have a decision on this specific issue. So it's really interesting for us to see that how coming from the civil society, this turn in the question of 3-4 years. So allow me just very briefly to tell you that we have a decision on land tenure, because at the beginning, civil society organizations, they took this as one of the most important things that needs to be addressed if we want to secure sustainable land management, and if we want to achieve land degradation neutrality, which is one of the targets within the Sustainable Development Goals. So little by little they were working, they were showing how by having some tenure secure and governance, we can improve the investment in the land. We can make some living out of the land in a more secure way. So that was taken by the parties, and finally, as Yes rightly mentioned at the beginning of this session, we have finally a decision that looks at this specific topic from different points of view. Of course, the issue of gender is extremely important and is very well portrayed. Also, since we have a gender action plan that was developed by the parties, and the access, the ownership, the security of tenure for women is very important and is portrayed in this action program. So we have this decision, and there are many issues that are interconnected. One of them, which is really interesting and we are working on right now, is to see how the voluntary guidelines on the governance, on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security, more known as the VGGT, sorry for the acronyms, but it's the only way to put it, could be integrated into the UNCCD, or the implementation of the UNCCD and this land degradation neutrality. So the Secretariat, together with FAO and other partners, we are going to try to see and present to the parties some guide on how integrate this voluntary guidelines, which are voluntary, but make them more integrated into what the countries have to do to implement this convention. So we are talking already some kind of a normative aspect. It's very good to see what we are doing on the ground, and the examples of Violet and Larissa are extremely important because they can also help to show that this is possible. And by integrating some voluntary guidelines, we are looking there at many aspects, including, of course, the access of vulnerable people to the land, and mechanisms for conflict resolution, and taking the land ownership also into consideration when we are doing some investment in the land, particularly large-scale investment. So this is really interesting and really important, particularly in the next few months before our next conference of the parties. I think I will stop here, and if we have any questions and we can go deeper, I'm ready to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos, for situating these discussions in a broader context. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and I would like to direct them to the different speakers. The first one goes to you, Larissa. Bottlenecks to scaling. What are these? How can they be overcome? And to Violet, the question, from your point of view, what are the indicators that are best suited to monitor the outcome of this social innovation so that these results can best be communicated to the relevant district or national level authorities? And second, whether you have any insights on the question of whether those women who gained access to land through the land leasing agreements, whether their social status within the pandemic is influenced, or how are they faring in comparison to other women who may not have gotten access to land. And I would like to start with Larissa.
Thank you, yes, and thank you for this very relevant question on the bottlenecks of scaling. And here I can maybe also share our experiences and future plans from our work in Burkina Faso, because right now, after this phase of extensive monitoring and now looking at, okay, how to go ahead, there's also lots of interest by the stakeholders who were involved in the process to indeed scale this process. So, but we must be very careful, because scaling doesn't mean like replicating now this process to all villages in Burkina Faso, because what worked in one village may not work in another village. So the question of like having a process that is somewhat scalable, applicable, but then needs to be context specific. So in Burkina Faso, for example, there are lots of different ethnic groups. We need to test this method certainly in different contexts. And then the question of capacities, of course, of the actors who will then implement it in different contexts. So the technical capacity, the financial capacity is something that may not be overlooked. So these are the challenges that two of the main challenges we are working on in this scaling process. Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. Violet, the questions on how to best monitor results to influence policymaking at district level and beyond. And second, whether there's any impact on the, any knowledge, any results that you could obtain on the differential impact of the pandemic on those women who were able to obtain land and those who were not yet able to obtain land.
Thank you so much. So the first question is, I'm going to share how we as an organization and TMG have been assessing some of the indicators that actually say why it's important for this to be recognized as a policy or to be put in a policy framework. One is the amount of land that we have has been able to be rehabilitated between this period of 2 years in the wards where we are working, compared to the amount of land that was rehabilitated before, or the engagement of the community, and especially women and youth participating. We are also looking at the number of women involved in soil rehabilitation for now, and also youth, I had mentioned that. We are also looking at the stakeholder engagement, how stakeholders are perceiving the chiefs. When we talk to the chiefs, they are sharing how conflict has been reduced. That's also an indicator how conflicts around land and issues around land governance have actually improved in those 2 wards where we began and the wards where we are extending. We are also looking at the intake of the application forms, because in our in the land lease guidelines, we have an application form that we are using to track, or for the 2 parties that are leasing land to be able to use. So we are looking at the uptake of the forms and how this actually translates to how many people are doing agriculture. We are also looking at many things, but I'll mention the last one, how women are accessing agriculture extension, because initially women and youth were not accessing, because you can't get an agriculture extension as one individual. But now that they are leasing land and they are doing in collective groups, the number has increased on how they're accessing agriculture and the knowledge in soil rehabilitation, including the trainings that are happening around that. I want to go to the next one, which is how women who are accessing land are faring on during this COVID. I will just give the example of Homa Bay recently, which is really, really touching my heart, because during this COVID period, 2 of our colleagues and myself visited this county. For the first time in this county, where land was lying idle and everyone was going to the lake to do fishmongering, which was increasing the spread of HIV, we saw how women were in the farms farming, and how the farms were even doing, how women were doing soil rehabilitation. In fact, when we went there, I went to the land and I was teaching about soil erosion, how they can cap soil erosion with vegetative clothes-rope barrier. So when I look at this, how women are now farming and how they are producing food, and food is available in this COVID time, when people cannot leave home to go and look for food, when there is a shortage in a livelihood. This is actually providing a livelihood, an alternative livelihood for women fishermongers. This is also in bringing food on the table for the women, and it's also addressing the issues of healthcare, which is actually like responding to the multiple SDGs, SDG on health, the SDG on hunger, the SDG on poverty, and gender equality. So this is actually something that I would compare to this current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Violet. I would like to share a couple of questions from the audience, and after these questions have been responded to, I would like to hand over to our 2 commentators, Sylvia and Lauren, so please do brace yourself. The first question goes to both Larissa and Violet, and it is whether there are any indications that there is interest by district level or national governments for uptake of these social innovations. And the second one, and I'll apologize for framing this in my words instead, slightly stepping out of my facilitator's role. Land distribution and land policies still carry the mark of the historical injustices of colonialism. And the question here is, to what extent can ecosystem restoration projects respond to these historical injustices that still sort of carry on, or the impacts can still be seen today. I know that UNCCD is working on a technical guide on how to address how to implement the land use decision. I think my personal response to this would be the absolute importance of securing community land rights, but I leave it to Marcus then, after Larissa and Violet have spoken, to respond to this in more detail. So first of all, first to you, Larissa and Violet, on the interest or the appetite by district or national level governments to take up these social innovations. Maybe Violet, you can start, and then Larissa.
Okay, the interest at the district level, I had mentioned earlier about a documentary that we did, which we were interviewing both government and community leaders. And when we look at the government from all departments, not just the Department of Agriculture, we are seeing how governments are looking at this as a solution of addressing land governance, as a solution in being able to address issues of agricultural productivity, which is a target for many governments to ensure that people have food on the table and people's livelihood is increased. So we are seeing a lot of interest from the government, even how when we go to the agriculture department in the new areas with this project of land lease. The moment we begin, I've worked in community on many projects, but when you are beginning on land lease as an alternative and then you take them through this format of the guidelines, the interest of the government really picks up. It's not like how we have been doing disinheritance that has so long procedures that keeps, this one is really taken very quickly by governments, and we see a lot of support from it. And we see how the agriculture extension are volunteering to work with the grassroots women to develop work plans in relations to things like soil rehabilitation, the kind of crops, trees that they would plant. So we are actually seeing a lot of interest, and even putting it in policy. It's actually like we are not the ones only fighting for it. We have members of the ward assemblies that are working with this in our discussions to how do we make this a policy for both first start beginning at the county, and then in the other 2 counties where we have begun also.
Thank you, Violet. Yeah. Larissa?
Yes, thank you. So regarding the interest of actors in Burkina Faso, right now we're actually working with them at 2 levels. So at the municipal level, there is a strong interest in scaling or like extending this method that we developed in one village to the neighboring villages. And actually, as we speak, our partner Graf is doing a capacity building workshop so that the agents of the municipality can now take over this approach and bring it to other villages. And at the national level, we are also working very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Department for Land. And here, the approach is actually very much welcomed with open arms, because right now in Burkina Faso, they really want to speed up implementation of the land framework. As said, so far it has been advancing very slowly, the formalization. So at this moment, they are also looking for how to really effectively implement the land law, and of course, how to ensure that women are not left behind. Because what happened in the past was that, for example, when land was formalized, it followed the usual practice of registering the land in the name of the household, and that is often men. So for women who are married, for example, in a married situation, this would leave them out. And so this process can also think beyond ownership rights, really looking at the different layers of tenure. So this is where our process that we developed in Tiaraco now comes in when it comes to the national level and the reform and increased implementation of the land governance framework in Burkina Faso. Thank you.
Thanks, Larissa. Marcos, now you inherit the very difficult question on the extent to which historical injustices might be addressed in the context of land degradation neutrality programs or ecosystem restoration programs that have a clear land tenure component.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, this is indeed a very tricky question, and this was already discussed during the Conference of the Parties. Of course, civil society organizations, they were bringing this into the discussion. The thing is, in the COP, as you know, this is a intergovernmental process, and what we are going to do, and this is the mandate that was given by the parties to the Secretariat, when looking at the this technical guide is also look at the national context. Of course, we cannot have, if you have seen the different technical guides that have been prepared by FAO, they are all documents that have been prepared and put there for the users. Could be lawyers, could be indigenous peoples, could be to facilitate also the governments and how they are integrated. In our case, this is going to be a bit more sui generis because it is expected that the parties themselves consider that technical guide. So it's and also the important thing is we have to look at that at the national context and be respectful with the national context and look at the different systems that are available in each one of the countries. So it's a very complex situation. We are now in the process of preparing this technical guide. There will be some kickoff meeting using the opportunity of June 17, which is the certification and drought day, if I can do some advertisement here. And it will be organized with FAO. And the idea is to have experts and stakeholders discussing about how we are going to do this integration of the voluntary guidelines into the implementation of the UNCCD and the land degradation neutrality.
Thank you, Marcos. And to the participant who has posed the question, we are in TMG Research is in close contact with a number of civil society organizations, and there is a strong interest of actually linking the discussion on the decadal ecosystem restoration actually with all the questions of land redistribution. So there is an ongoing discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have, despite of the panelists being so outspoken and well-informed, we don't have a panelist who could address this question, but I would encourage the participant to just reach out to us. We're happy to also facilitate the contact. Now, having said all this, I would like to hand over to our first commentator, who is Sylvia Kuria from Kenya, organic farmer and ambassador of IFWAM, and successful agricultural entrepreneur of the company called Sylvia's Basket. Sylvia, I hope you're there, because then I will shut up and leave the floor to you.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. And thank you for that very nice introduction. Yeah, so we're running a farm, and I started farming a few years ago, and maybe just to share my experience about what I've been doing. So basically, I've been running the farm, and how I started was by just starting a small kitchen garden, because, you know, women are the custodians of the health of their families. And that's how I started off, you know, just to make sure that we have enough food for our families. And with time then I started training my neighbors, the local women, just teaching them how to use their, you know, small organic kitchen gardens to make sure that they have enough food throughout, and, you know, just using the proper practices, you know, of composting, crop rotation, mulching, just so that they can be able to take care of their soil. And the thing about it, like even listening to everybody else, you know, where we are talking about, you know, we are doing it as a small scale, will it really work? And we say, yes, it works. You know, I started with 1/2 acre, and now we are doing organic farming actively on 8 acres on our farm. And when you count even the women we are working with, you find that, you know, they start small. And what I tell them basically is, when you start small and you're able to actually you know, take care of the soil now, the soil is going to reward you. The soil is going to reward you 5 years, 10 years to come, instead of using chemical inputs that will, you know, make you not have enough food, and make sure to take care of your soil very well. So we have a few challenges where we're not able to follow them up well. They don't have enough water, but we're doing it at a small scale. It's not too big, but it's working. Thank you very much.
Sylvia, as you have been so astute when it comes to timing, could you maybe just add one sentence on sort of the situation, or the land tenure situation of the lands of your farm and your fellow farmers? Sort of, how is the land tenure situation influencing these heavy investments that you are currently undertaking?
Yeah, so basically, for most of the women farmers, they actually own some small pieces of land together with their husbands. But why I decided to go towards the issue of kitchen gardens is because maybe the husband will allow the woman to actually just, do something small in the corner of the compound without anyone really bothering them. Because now when you think about the women having to go out and grow things on 5, 6, 7 acres, the husband will not allow that. So that's unfortunate. So the women still don't have a big choice, and they don't have the tenure, they don't own large parcels of land, and even if they do, they don't have a choice. So that's why we started just with a small kitchen garden model, which is working quite well. It's small, but it's growing slowly.
Thank you, Sylvia, for these additional comments. Now, Lauren, I understand that you are working on a repository of sort of social innovation of the type that have been discussed here, and I would also like to give you the opportunity to please comment on what you've heard before. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you. And I want to especially thank Violet, Orissa, and Sylvia. Their insight was so crucial. The Library for Food Sovereignty is a platform that we developed, designed, implemented, and governed by the community themselves. This platform seeks to collectivize innovation and democratize the information in a way to make all of the successes, the stories, the failures, the learning lessons available for a community, because the revolution in agriculture might not be televised, but it will be open source. And what little I have more to say is that it's essential that we center on human rights, especially when we're engaging along environmental causes. Our relationship with the environment is a reflection of our relationship within society. There will be no sustainable ecosystem when patriarchy and hierarchy exist. When we center on these social issues, we begin to understand how land tenure, as well as credit access or market facilitation, input dependencies, pollution, climate change, and yes, colonialization are all unfairly affecting women more than men. Women in agriculture, against all odds, still produce a majority of local food, where in some places in Africa, it's up to 90% of the local food. And agriculture is a 10,000-year-old force that is tipping the balance against women's equality. So our role in the industrial north is twofold: get as much resources as possible into women's hands to change their local ecology the way they deem appropriate, not us. And secondly, to be storytellers that amplify and leverage the vital role that women play. This framing is so important because just maybe, and this might be hard for some people to hear, is that solving climate change has more to do with gender equality than Tesla or soil carbon.
Thank you, Lauren. If the time would be up, I would have said these would be very nice concluding words, but as we fortunately still have some time, I think I would allow the panelists to quickly respond to the two commentators. So Marcos, Larissa, Violet, if you feel like responding to Sylvia and Lauren. And thanks, Lauren and Sylvia, for your valuable contributions.
Thank you. I don't have anything. I'm just acknowledging that we are all speaking the same language on the importance of ensuring that community interventions are actually adopted when we are talking about issues of landscaping. So thank you so much for the other speakers.
Thanks, Violet. Larissa, do I see your virtual hand?
Yes. Thank you for giving me again the chance for a last comment, which I hope builds on the previous comments by the commentators. So I would like to pick up the issue of social innovations, which has been discussed, and it shows that it's really necessary, especially when it comes to land governance and equal rights to land for women and men. As a matter of fact, 3/4 of the world's population have today no access to formal systems to register and safeguard their land, and most of these people are already in a vulnerable situation in society. And if we continue with this pace of land formalization, of course, it would take centuries. So we do need these social innovations that we have been speaking about today. And also, if I can refer to Tim Christofferson from UNEP, who concluded in session 1, we do need social change as well to make the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration successful. So what I think we also need to discuss more, what we really need is an enabling environment for social innovations to emerge. And for that, I think what the interventions have shown today is really we do need to support local civil society organizations, such as grassroots organizations, Shibuya Health Workers, headed by my fellow panelist and colleague Violet, because these are really key to facilitate the process in a matter that we can really develop great innovations. Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. Marcos?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the words of Sylvia and Lauren. It's really interesting to see, continue seeing what is going on and what is happening at the ground level. Ourselves at the United Nations, what we try to do is bring the countries at the intergovernmental level, but it's good to showcase what is coming from the bottom, this bottom-up approach, showing what is there, and make this change possible. And it's, of course, linked to the Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. When we are going to talk about the different projects that will be, most of them done in the land, issue of land, issue of gender should be taken into consideration. Climate change is the same. There was a decision, one of COP25. I'm really sorry I'm bringing the boring part to here, but I think it's also important. At the next meeting of the subsidiary bodies, the chair of the SABSTA is going to organize an interactive dialogue on land and climate change. If you have access to the different submissions presented, particularly those from civil society, they are putting the accent on land rights and land tenure, which is something that is more and more important. And we can see the linkages that are there. Nothing more. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marcos. Sylvia, I will hand over the concluding words to you, if you feel like it. But before I do so, Marcos, the TMG team has been responsible for actually writing 2 of these technical guides. And I think if I can leave one piece of unwanted advice, I think it would really be to truly build on those initiatives and projects that were mentioned by Sylvia, Violet, Larissa, and Lauren, because I think it's these where parties will truly find a source of inspiration to take this forward. And the legal recognitions, as important as they are, might not necessarily always have the level of inspiration than what might be needed to really take these difficult questions forward. We have to close sharply at 8, so will not comment any further, but leave the concluding words to Sylvia.
Okay, thank you very much for that. What maybe I would just like to say is that, it's so good that we have a chance from the field to actually share our story and what's happening. And what I want us to do is, let's see how we can be able to link the stories, with the research and the scientific knowledge, because many times there's normally a very big gap between the practice and the knowledge. So if we can be able to see how to work together and move ahead, then we can actually now bring the stories and bring the knowledge and the expertise and bring it together so that there's a bridge and everyone can be able to benefit at the end of it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. So I can only thank the 2 marvelous commentators, the great panel, Bruno and Matteo have been working tirelessly in the back, Sarah for facilitation, and of course, our great GLF colleagues for organizing everything so swiftly. I would like to thank you. I hope the participants had an interesting early evening, late afternoon. I thank you very much. I hope we stay in touch, and take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.